Somewhere in ancient Persia, priests were keeping track of something enormous. Not a harvest cycle, not a king's reign, a plan for the entire universe, divided into exactly 4 ages of 3,000 years each. 12,000 years total, from the first breath of creation to the final remaking of everything that exists. And here's the strange part. This isn't some vague myth about a long time ago or in the beginning. This is structured, numbered, almost mathematical in how precise it is. Creation gets its 3,000 years. Then the enemy shows up and things get messy for another 3,000. Then a prophet arrives to turn the tide for 3,000 more. And finally, the last stretch where everything builds toward a cosmic reset that fixes the world permanently. Why would an ancient religion, thousands of years before spreadsheets or calendars as we know them, organize the fate of the universe like this? Like someone was running a countdown? And here's where it gets even more interesting. This isn't the only culture that thought in these terms. Hindu tradition talks about 4 yugas, ages of the world that decline from golden perfection down to chaos before starting over. Mesopotamian texts describe kings who ruled before a great flood wiped the slate clean. Greek philosophers talked about a great year, a cosmic cycle ending in fire, where the universe basically reboots itself. Different cultures, different continents, sometimes different centuries, all circling this same idea. The world runs on a clock, and eventually that clock hits 0 and something resets. So what's actually going on here? Did these cultures influence each other through trade routes and empires bumping into each other across the ancient world? Or are we looking at something else entirely? Something built into how human minds process time, decay, and renewal, no matter where those minds happen to be born. That's the real question driving this whole video. Not just what the Zoroastrian timeline says, but why so many ancient civilizations, separated by oceans and mountains and centuries, kept landing on eerily similar structures for how the world begins, breaks down, and gets fixed. Now, before we go further, I want to be upfront about something. A lot of what survives about this Zoroastrian timeline comes from texts written centuries after Zarathustra himself, compiled and expanded by later priests, trying to systematize older oral traditions. So we're going to be careful here, separating what the earliest sources actually say from what got added later, and what modern writers have layered on top in the age of internet mysticism. I'll flag the difference as we go because that distinction matters if you actually want to understand this instead of just being told a cool story. If you're listening to this late at night trying to drift off, that's honestly why I make these. So tell me, where are you right now and what time is it there? I check the comments constantly, and it's wild seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, and Los Angeles at dinner, all reading the same words at the exact same moment. And if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is following on Spotify and leaving a 5-star review. Links in the description. Costs nothing, takes 10 seconds, and it genuinely helps. Alright, let's start where this story actually starts. Not with a reset, with the blueprint. Let's get one thing straight before we go any further. When we talk about a timeline in Zoroastrianism, we're not talking about a timeline the way you'd find one in a history textbook. No dates you could circle on a calendar. No year 0 you could point to on a map of ancient Persia and say, this is when it started. We're talking about something else entirely. Mythic time. Cosmic time. The kind of time that exists in the space between story and cosmology, where numbers carry meaning but don't necessarily correspond to anything you could verify with a stack of clay tablets or a king's inscription. This distinction matters more than you might think, because ancient Persia absolutely had historical time too. Real kings, real dates, real events we can cross-reference with Babylonian records and Greek historians. Cyrus, The great conquered Babylon in a year we can pin down. Darius left inscriptions we can date. That's political history, the stuff of empires rising and falling, and it runs on a completely different track than the cosmic drama we're about to unpack. The 12,000-year plan doesn't live in that world. It lives in sacred narrative, the kind of deep time that religious traditions use to explain not what happened on a Tuesday in 550 BCE, but what's happening cosmically every single day. It's less like a history book and more like a blueprint for reality itself, one that priests and theologians built up over centuries to explain why the world is the way it is, why good and evil seem locked in this endless struggle, and where it's all supposed to end up. So here's the basic shape of it, and I want to give you the skeleton now because we're going to spend a lot of time putting flesh on these bones later. Zoroastrian cosmic history is usually broken into 3 broad phases, though as we just heard, some traditions stretch that into 4 numbered stretches of 3,000 years apiece. First comes creation, the period where Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, brings the spiritual world into being. Then comes mixture, sometimes called Gumagician in the old Pahlavi texts, the era when the material world gets made, when good and evil become tangled together, when the enemy shows up and things get complicated. And finally comes what's often translated as separation or renovation, Frashokereti, the point where everything gets sorted out, purified, and restored to what it was always meant to be. 3 broad acts, sometimes 4 numbered scenes, depends which source you're reading and which century that source was written in. Now, why 12,000? Why not 10,000 or 7,000 or some other number that feels equally arbitrary to modern ears? This is where I want you to slow down and resist the urge to treat this like a prophecy with a due date. Numbers like 12,000, broken into 4 clean segments of 3,000, aren't astronomical measurements. Nobody was tracking planetary orbits and calculating an actual countdown to the end of the world. These numbers are symbolic, they're schematic, they're doctrinal tools, ways of organizing a story so it feels balanced, complete, purposeful. 4 is a satisfying number. 3,000 divided evenly into 4 equal ages gives you symmetry, and symmetry is exactly what you want if you're trying to convince people that the universe has a plan, that chaos isn't chaos at all but part of a structure that's unfolding exactly as intended. Think about how we still do this today. We talk about the ages of man. We divide history into neat categories: Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, even though the actual transitions between those periods were messy, overlapping, and happened at wildly different times depending on where you were standing on the planet. Ancient priests weren't doing science when they carved reality into 4 even chunks of 3,000 years. They were doing theology, they were doing what every culture that's ever tried to make sense of time has done, taking the overwhelming mess of lived experience and imposing an order on it that feels meaningful, memorable, and morally satisfying. But here's where things get genuinely tricky, and I promised you earlier I'd flag this stuff as we go. Zoroastrianism isn't one single unified tradition with one single unified timeline that everybody agreed on from day one. It's more accurate to think of it as a living tradition that evolved over more than 1,000 years, absorbing new ideas, losing old ones, getting reinterpreted by different priestly schools in different political circumstances. The version of the 12,000-year scheme that gets quoted most often, the one with the tidy 4-part structure, comes largely from Middle Persian texts, Pahlavi compilations written down centuries after the Achaemenid Empire had already come and gone. Some of these texts, like the Bundahishn, are essentially theological encyclopedias, attempts by later priests to systematize scattered older material into something coherent. Which means when you read about the Zoroastrian timeline, you're often reading a synthesis, a later interpretation layered on top of much older and much more fragmentary source material. So what are we actually working with, source-wise? There's the Avesta, the oldest core of Zoroastrian scripture, including the Gathas, hymns traditionally attributed to Zarathustra himself, written in an archaic form of the Avestan language. These earliest layers are frustratingly thin on cosmic chronology. They give us theology, ethics, hymns of praise, but not a neat numbered timeline. That level of detail comes later, mostly through the Pahlavi texts, Middle Persian works composed and compiled during and after the Sasanian period, roughly the 3rd through 7th centuries of the Common Era. Texts like the Bonda Hishna, the Zandai Vohuman Yasht, and various other commentaries. These are the sources that give us the specific numbers, the 3,000-year phases, the detailed cast of cosmic characters, the blow-by-blow account of how creation unfolds and eventually gets renovated. So, as we move forward through this timeline, phase by phase, keep that layered history in mind. We're not reading a single ancient prophecy carved in stone on day one of the religion. We're reading a tradition's evolving attempt, across more than 1,000 years, to answer some of the biggest questions humans have ever asked. Where did we come from? Why does the world feel broken? And is there an end point where it finally gets fixed? That's the timeline we're about to walk through, not a countdown clock. A cosmic story still being told. If you go looking for that clean 12,000-year plan we just outlined, you don't find it sitting intact in some pristine ancient master text. You find it in pieces, fragments, layers, and a lot of those layers are fairly late. Let's start with the big name that gets thrown around the most, the Bundahishn. If the Zoroastrian universe had a user manual, this would be it. The title literally means primal creation. It's a Middle Persian work, probably compiled between the 9th and 11th centuries CE, pulling together older Sasanian-era priestly traditions. This is where you see the 12,000-year scheme laid out almost like a blueprint. 4 periods of 3,000 years, what happens in each, how Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu move when the saviors arrive, how Frashokereti plays out. From the Bundahishn you get lines like, the first 3,000 years in spiritual form, the next 3,000 with material creation, but without mixture, the next 3,000 with mixture and struggle, and the final 3,000 with the appearance of Zarathustra and the last saviors leading to renovation. Different manuscripts phrase it slightly differently, but that basic scaffolding is there. This is the text that makes the system look tidy. Then there's the Denkard. Think of the Denkard as a massive late antique library catalogue crossed with a theological handbook. Also in Middle Persian, it preserves summaries of older Avestan works that were already disappearing or gone by the time it was compiled, probably 9th-10th century CE. The Denkard doesn't always spell out the 12,000 years as neatly as the Bundahishn, but it reinforces the same concept, a finite, planned duration for the world, divided into successive eras marked by prophetic figures and escalating conflict. You also have the Zand traditions. Zand basically means exegesis or commentary. Zand texts are where priests gloss the Avestan scriptures in Middle Persian, explain obscure words, and then often go far beyond translation into full-blown interpretation. It's inside these commentaries, on works like the Yashts or the Vidyavdad, that you start seeing the abstract theology of the older Avesta welded to a more rigid timetable. The text will quote a short Avestan passage and then launch into paragraphs of explanation about when in the cosmic calendar that line is supposed to be playing out. A particularly influential piece here is the Zandi Vohuman Yasht, often called Bahman Yasht in older scholarship, even though it's not the same as the Avestan Bahman Yasht. It's an apocalyptic Middle Persian text that lays out a prophetic vision of coming ages, dynasties, corruptions, and finally the triumph of good. It plugs that narrative into the idea of a finite world span. Again, the exact numbers and subdivisions vary by manuscript, but the basic assumption is the same. The world is running on a fixed, divinely calculated clock. All of these works, Bundahischen, Denkard, Zand commentaries, Zandi Vohum and Yasht, are post-Avestan. They're also, crucially, part of a priestly project of systematization. The Sasanian and early Islamic periods were times when Zoroastrian priests were trying to codify, defend, and rationalize their tradition in the face of imperial politics, competing religions, and the looming reality of Islam. So they took older ideas, some probably very old, and stitched them together into comprehensive systems. Now, contrast that with the Avestan layer itself. The Avesta isn't one book, it's a corpus. At its core, you've got the Gathas, archaic hymns that most scholars think are genuinely very early, maybe as close as we'll ever get to Zarathustra's own voice. Around those you have the younger Avesta, ritual texts, hymns to various divinities, legal material, myths. This material was transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, probably in stages under the Sasanians. Here's the important part. The Gathas do not hand you a 12,000-year script. They talk about an age or cycle of existence, about the final renovation, about the end of the lie and the victory of Ashur. They absolutely give you a dualistic drama and a sense of cosmic direction. But they don't say, the world will last exactly 12,000 years, divided into 4 equal periods of 3,000 years, starting now. Even the younger Avesta, which has more mythic detail, is vague on absolute numbers. You get hints of ordered time, of sequences, of a future saviour figure. You don't get the fully gridded timeline. That grid appears clearly only once you move into Middle Persian territory and let the priests start doing math. And this is where transmission issues crash into the conversation. We're dealing with a tradition that was overwhelmingly oral for a long time. Hymns and ritual formulas were memorized, recited and guarded by priestly families. Commentary was taught in person. By the time things are written down, we're already looking at an edited snapshot of a living, changing stream. Redaction matters here. Sasanian authorities sponsored the collection and organization of the Avesta. That means choices were made: what to include, what to emphasize, how to line up older material with newer doctrinal schemes. Later, under Islamic rule, Zoroastrian communities in Iran and eventually India kept copying and recopying these texts, often adding clarifications or harmonizing contradictions along the way. That's why different manuscripts of the Bundahischen, for example, don't always agree on all the details of the cosmic calendar. The system is there, but it isn't frozen. So what do scholars broadly agree on? They agree that some kind of finite world period and final renovation is very old in the tradition. The idea that history has an end point, Frashokereti, is already present in the Gathas in embryo form. They agree that a structured sequence of ages, marked by Zarathustra and later saviour figures, is solidly attested in the Middle Persian period, and probably reflects earlier priestly teaching. They also mostly agree that the specific 12,000-year, 4 times 3,000 breakdown is a later systematization. It might preserve older numerical symbolism, but in the form we have it, it's Sasanian and post-Sasanian priests doing architecture, taking mythic themes and locking them into a symmetrical schedule. There's debate over how far back that exact arithmetic goes. Some see it foreshadowed in certain Avestan turns of phrase, or in Iranian royal ideology. Others are more cautious and say, we just don't know. What remains debated is the direction of influence. Did Iranian priests come up with this structure in isolation? Did they adapt and refine ideas circulating in the broader Near Eastern and Hellenistic world? Or did later Jewish, Christian and Islamic thinkers borrow from the Iranian model? The honest answer right now is Some influences look plausible, but almost none of them can be proven with the kind of certainty people on the internet like to claim. Which brings us to how we're going to handle this in the rest of the video. Every time we talk about that 12,000-year plan showing up somewhere else, whether it's in Indian Yugas, Greek World Ages, or modern reset fantasies, we're going to ask three questions. First, does the Zoroastrian source itself actually say 12,000 years and 4 ages, or are we reading a modern reconstruction back into it? Second, does the supposed parallel tradition really have the same structure, or just a vague resemblance that could be coincidence or convergent thinking? And third, is there any historical mechanism of contact, trade, conquest, shared elites, documented borrowing that would let that idea reasonably travel from one culture to another? If the answer to those questions is yes, yes, and probably, then we can talk about influence as a live possibility. If the answer is sort of, not really, and we have no evidence, then we're in the territory of poetic parallels and modern myth-making, not firm historical connection. With that in mind, we can finally step inside the story these texts are trying to tell. We've seen where the scaffold comes from. Now we can watch how the cosmic drama gets populated, who's on the stage, what they're fighting over, and why a neat timeline made their struggle feel both terrifying and strangely reassuring. To understand why a 12,000-year plan even makes sense in Zoroastrianism, you have to know who's actually on the board and what kind of game they're playing. Because this is not a free-for-all of random gods doing whatever they want. It's a very specific kind of conflict, with a very specific moral logic baked in from the start. At the centre is Ahura Mazda. In the Gathas, he isn't just one god among many. He's the wise lord, the source of Asha, truth, right order, the way things are supposed to be. Asha is cosmic law and ethical law at the same time. It's gravity and justice in a single word. For Zarathustra, to align with Ahura Mazda is to align with Asha, honesty over deceit, order over chaos, constructive thought over destructive impulse. Opposing that is Druj, the lie, not just telling fibs, but a whole orientation toward reality that twists, corrupts, and unravels. In the later tradition, this takes concrete form as Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Older Avestan material is a bit more abstract and ambiguous about how to name the adversary, but by the Sasanian period the picture is crystallized. Ahura Mazda versus Angra Mainyu, two primal spirits locked in opposition. Here's the key thing. This is ethical dualism, not a Marvel-style two equal gods punching forever. Ahura Mazda is the creator of all that is truly real, good and enduring. Angra Mainyu cannot create in the same sense. He can only invade, distort, parasitize what already exists. The lie has power, but it's derivative. It feeds on what it corrupts. In the Gathas, Zarathustra talks about the two primal mentalities that people must choose between, one aligned with Asha, one aligned with the lie. Humanity isn't just collateral damage in a cosmic fistfight. We are the battleground. Every thought, word and deed becomes a micro-decision. Are you reinforcing Asha or strengthening Druj? That ethical razor's edge is what makes a timeline meaningful in the first place. Time is the arena where those choices accumulate. Now add the time limit. In a lot of religious mythologies, cosmic struggle is potentially endless. Ages cycle. Gods rise and fall, worlds are born and destroyed, and then the wheel turns again. Zoroastrianism takes a different route. From fairly early on, there's the conviction that this conflict is finite. There was a time before the invasion of the lie. There will be a time after its final defeat. The 12,000-year scheme is just one very sharpened version of an older intuition. The war has an end date that matters psychologically. If evil is co-eternal and co-infinite with good, You can never be sure your efforts stick. If evil is powerful but ultimately doomed, then every ethical act is a contribution toward a guaranteed outcome. Ahura Mazda isn't gambling, he knows the ending. The timetable doesn't create the victory, it expresses that confidence as a schedule. But Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu are not the only players. Around Ahura Mazda you have the Amesha Spentus, often translated as the bounteous immortals. Think of them as facets of the divine that are also personal beings. Each embodies a core aspect of Asher and of the created world: Vohu Mana, good mind; Asher Vahishta, best truth, right order; Kashathra Vairya, desirable dominion; Spenta Almighty, holy devotion; Hawavatat, wholeness; Ameritat, immortality. In later thought, they're both cosmic principles and something like archangels, patterns you're supposed to imitate, and also powers that actively assist. Then there are the Yazatas, those worthy of worship. These are a wider array of divine beings linked to elements, virtues, and cosmic functions: Mithra with contracts and covenants, Anahita with waters and fertility, Saoshyant with ritual and attentive listening, and many more. They're not competitors to Ahura Mazda. They're his team, his administration, his distributed presence in the world. On the other side, Angra Mainyu isn't alone either. He has devas, demonic beings that in Zoroastrian polemic are often what other Iranians or neighbours had treated as gods. There are specific chief demons mapped as mirror images of the Amesha Spentus. Where Ahura Mazda offers good mind, the adversary offers Achaemenid, bad mind. Where you have devotion, you get indifference. Where you have sovereign dominion, you get tyrannical force. It's an anti-pantheon, a parasite hierarchy. Put this all together and you get an ecosystem of alignment. Every feature of reality has a truth mode and a lie mode, a version under Asher and a version under Druge. Politics can be just rule or oppressive rule, speech can be honest counsel or manipulative propaganda. Even elements of nature can be ordered or polluted. The Amesha Spentas and Yazatas work through humans and through the fabric of the world to keep things aligned with Asher. The demonic forces try to bend those same structures toward chaos and decay. Here's where the reset idea starts taking shape. Because the conflict is time-bounded, dualism isn't just a description of the present mess. It's a roadmap. We're in a phase of mixture where Asher and Druge are entangled. But that entanglement is temporary. The final Frashokereti isn't a restart of an eternal cycle. It's a decisive renovation. The lie gets burned out, neutralized, rendered inert. The world doesn't get scrapped, it gets perfected. The reset is more like a final software patch that removes all malware and locks the system against future infection. Not a factory reset that wipes everything, including your data. This is very different from, say, Indian Yuga cycles or certain Greek notions of recurring world ages, where the cosmos can loop back through golden and iron ages indefinitely. In the Zoroastrian frame, dualism is dramatic, but it's not symmetrical and it's not endless. Good has ontological depth. Evil is a transient distortion. The 12,000-year clock simply articulates how long the distortion is allowed to run before the system is cleaned and stabilized forever. We do need to flag some cautions here. Dualism in Zoroastrianism is not a single unchanging thing. Early Gathic rhetoric, later Avestan mythology, Sasanian scholastic theology, and modern Parsi apologetics all nuance the relationship between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu differently. Some texts sound almost like two co-eternal principles. Others emphasize Ahura Mazda's supremacy so strongly that Angra Mainyu looks more like a catastrophic mistake that will inevitably be undone. Scholars debate whether the sharper, more metaphysical dualism is original or a later development under pressure from rival systems like Manichaeism. There's also ongoing argument about how literally we should take some of the demon catalogues and angelic hierarchies. Are we looking at rigid dogma, or at flexible mythic language priests used in different ways at different times? What's stable across those variations, though, is the core structure, a world divided between truth and lie, order and chaos, a set of divine and demonic agents pulling in opposite directions, and a future in which that tension ends, not just resets. That's the logic that makes a 12,000-year plan feel not just plausible within Zoroastrianism, but almost inevitable. If the war is real and morally loaded, and if the right side is guaranteed to win, of course you'll eventually start asking, how long until the victory is complete? And priests, being priests, will eventually answer that question with a calendar. With the cast and the stakes in place, the next step is to see how they say the drama actually unfolds, how creation itself is staged, how the invasion happens, and why the first few thousand years of the plan play out mostly in a realm you and I never see directly. Phase 1 starts before anything you and I would recognize as a world even exists. According to later Zoroastrian tradition, when Ahura Mazda decides to create, he does not just snap his fingers and drop a finished cosmos into being. The first 3,000-year block of the 12,000-year plan is not about mountains and rivers and animals. It's about pattern. It's about drafting the blueprint. Texts like the Bundahishan compiled in the early Islamic period, but drawing on older Sasanian material, describe an initial creation that is perfectly ordered and entirely spiritual. No decay, no conflict, no mixture. Think of it as a cosmic prototype running in a clean simulation, sealed off from malware. In this phase, Ahura Mazda brings forth the spiritual forms of everything that will later appear materially. The Amesha Spentas aren't just advisors, they are the axes along which the blueprint is drawn. Good mind, right order, devotion, dominion, wholeness, immortality. Each of these is both a divine being and a template line. Cattle, plants, fire, water, even the sky itself have Fravashis, pre-existing spiritual essences that stand by in this pristine state. Nothing in this first creation dies, nothing breaks. Nothing resists its own purpose. Time exists, but it's like a held breath, a countdown, rather than a process of change. The tradition explicitly ties this phase to a 3,000-year span, but it's not 3,000 years of history. It's 3,000 years of design and fortification, and that's where the safeguards come in. Ahura Mazda knows Angra Mainyu exists. This isn't a story where the bad guy leaps out unexpectedly from behind a cosmic bush. In the more developed theological versions, the wise lord anticipates the attack and bakes the defense into the very structure of creation. One way later authors explain it is almost like a legal trap. Ahura Mazda reveals the future to Angra Mainyu, the whole timeline, including his own defeat, before material creation begins. By reacting to that revelation with rage and choosing to attack anyway, the destructive spirit essentially locks himself into a finite script. His freedom is real enough to make his choice meaningful, but once he chooses, the duration of his power is capped. This is why the time limit is set from the very beginning. The 12,000-year plan isn't patched on later as damage control. It's part of the initial conditions. Phase 1 is the moment when the rules are agreed, the arena is defined, and the countdown starts ticking. Spiritual beings are assigned their roles. The metaphysical equivalents of safety rails and firewalls go up. Even the eventual Frashokereti, the final renovation, is already, in a sense, present as a possibility inside the design. If that sounds abstract, it's supposed to. We are still in the realm before matter, before mixture. Zoroastrian priests later loved to contrast this with the messy middle we live in. You have an initial pure state, then an invasion and entanglement, then a purified final state. The first 3,000 years and the last 3,000 years mirror each other. Creation and renovation are two ends of the same line. You can hear this echo in how they talk about resurrection bodies and the renewed earth. At the end, the world is not replaced, it's brought back into alignment with its original pattern. The ideal forms from Phase 1 become fully realized in matter without vulnerability to Angra Mainyu. Water is still water, but no longer pollutable. Animals still live, but no longer prey on each other. Humans still choose, but the field of choice has been cleared of systemic distortion. In other words, the blueprint is not discarded after the fall. It remains the reference document. History is the painful process of bringing the corrupted build back into conformity with that original spec. This makes Zoroastrian reset language very different from later flood myths you see in Mesopotamia, the Hebrew Bible or Greek legend. Those stories usually assume the material world is already in play. Humanity messes up, and the gods send a catastrophe, flood, fire, storm, to wipe the slate and try again. Reset as punishment, reset as cleanup after the party. Phase 1 in Zoroastrian cosmology is pre-catastrophe. It's not a reboot after things go wrong, it's a staged deployment before the system ever goes live. There is no material world yet to drown or burn. There is, instead, a waiting pattern and an enemy massing on the border. That's why the tone of this phase is so different from apocalyptic destruction myths. The danger is anticipated, not reacted to. The defences are preventative, not therapeutic. Ahura Mazda doesn't destroy a failed world to build a new one. He constructs an invadable world in full awareness that it will be attacked, and he limits how long that attack can actually matter. Some scholars see in this a kind of theological engineering mindset. The universe is not a whim, it's a project. The first 3,000 years are like drafting, modelling and stress, testing the design against the worst possible adversary. Only once that's done does Ahura Mazda instantiate the plan in matter, knowing exactly how and when the malware will hit, and exactly how it will be removed. And that sets up the next pivot in the story, because as soon as you move from blueprint to implementation, the safe distance disappears. The realm of pure forms gives way to a vulnerable mixed reality where spirit and matter are tightly interwoven. The adversary finally has something to bite into. The second phase of 3,000 years will be about that first bite, about the moment the lie crosses the boundary and time stops being a quiet countdown and becomes a battlefield. So the border is drawn, the rules are fixed, the blueprint is locked in. Now comes the part every later storyteller leaned on, the breach. In Zoroastrian cosmology, the core turning point is not when the world is made. It's when the world is made attackable and Angra Mainyu actually charges in. That's the moment the timeline stops being a quiet chart on Ahura Mazda's desk and turns into a live battlefield with a ticking clock. Different texts paint the scene with different levels of mythic colour, but the logic is the same. Once the spiritual prototype is complete, Ahura Mazda brings forth the material world in a single act of creation that marks the start of the next 3,000-year segment. The heavens become a solid dome. The waters spread, the earth takes shape, the primordial bull and the first human are established. It's the first full deployment of the blueprint into matter, and Angra Mainyu, who has been sitting in his own realm of darkness, sees this. In some tellings, he's been stunned or paralysed for those initial 3,000 years by the vision of his own defeat. In others, he simply bides his time. Either way, the appearance of a vulnerable, luminous world on the edge of his domain is like blood in the water. He rallies his demons, his devas, and hurls himself at the frontier of creation. That assault is the real start of history in the Zoroastrian imagination. Not the initial creation, but the invasion. The moment Angra Mainyu crosses the boundary, something fundamental changes. Before you had two realms, one purely good, one purely destructive, facing off across a metaphysical gap. After the invasion, you get a third condition, mixture. Mixture is one of those dry theological words that hides how dramatic the idea really is. In Middle Persian sources, they love this term, gumezisn, because it's the key to understanding everything that follows. Light and darkness, truth and lie, life and death are no longer separated into distinct zones. They are forced into the same arena, the same bodies, the same timeline. The good creations don't vanish when the attack comes. They get contaminated. The sky is still there, but now it can be bruised by smoke and storm. The waters still flow, but they can be befouled, dried up, poisoned. The earth is still solid, but it can be cracked by earthquakes and mined and defiled. The primordial bull is struck down, and from its body come all later animal species, life emerging through a wound. The first human, Gyomard, is killed by Angra Mainyu's assault, and from his seed, after a long delay in the earth, the first mortal couple arises. Creation isn't undone. It's dragged into a state where every good thing can be twisted, damaged, or co-opted. That's mixture. And this is where the 12,000-year plan really becomes a moral drama, instead of a static metaphysical chart. Once the world is mixed, it's no longer enough for goodness simply to exist. It has to struggle. It has to choose. Every act within the mixed world can lean toward one side or the other, reinforcing either the order Ahura Mazda intended or the distortion Angra Mainyu introduced. Zoroastrian texts are blunt about this. The mixture period is the time when the battle of the two spirits is fought out in concrete detail. It's not a war happening somewhere above your head, with humans as collateral damage. The war runs through everything, through bodies, through ecosystems, through social institutions, through individual decisions. That gives human choice enormous weight. Once you have a mixed reality, every ethical decision is no longer just about personal virtue or sin. It becomes an act of collaboration. Are you cooperating with Asher, truth, right order, or with Druge, the lie? Are you strengthening the side that wants to bring the world back into alignment with its original blueprint, or the side that wants to lock it into corruption? This is why later Zoroastrian law codes care about things like how you dispose of a corpse, how you treat fire, how you handle water. It's not ritual fussiness for its own sake. A corpse, for instance, is where the forces of decay most visibly latch onto the good creation. Mishandling it is, symbolically and cosmically, aiding the enemy. Respecting it properly is participating in the defense. So when priests talk about the second 3,000-year phase as the time of mixture, they're not just naming a condition. They're naming a battleground. The world is good at its root because its design comes from Ahura Mazda, but it is not untouched. It's occupied territory, and that has consequences for how time itself is imagined. In a lot of other ancient systems, especially in India and parts of the Greek world, the default way to think about cosmic history is cyclical. Ages rise and fall, worlds are created and destroyed, and then the whole thing loops. The point of the drama, if there is one, is often to escape the wheel, or just to endure its rotations. Zoroastrianism, anchored in this invasion narrative, goes a different direction. Because the attack has a clear before and after, the story can't be an endless loop of identical ages. You have a pure phase, a breached and mixed phase, and a final purified phase. Those are not three slices of a repeating cycle. They're stages in a one-off project. The invasion is a rupture that you don't rewind. That's why the 12,000 years are laid out as a linear countdown, rather than as segments in a great circle. The reset at the end is not a return to square one with all the same vulnerabilities. It's a renovation that locks in the gains, removes the intruder, and restores the world to its original pattern without reopening the border. There are parallels here with other myths of intrusion and rupture. You can think of the Titanomachy in Greek myth, where an older order is violently overthrown, or the descent of chaos monsters in Mesopotamian stories who have to be subdued for the cosmos to stabilize. You can even line it up cautiously with biblical ideas of a fall that alters the terms of human existence. But the Zoroastrian version is unusual in how tightly it integrates invasion, mixture, and an explicit timeline with an endpoint. The breach is not just a colourful prelude, it sets up a finite war with a scheduled conclusion. For now, though, we're still in the middle of that war, the long era where the material world is the contested middle ground. The next phase of the story zooms in on how that mixed condition actually plays out, how the good creation is rolled out in detail, and how every layer of it becomes both a target and a weapon in the struggle. Once mixture begins, the material world isn't just a backdrop, it's the main piece on the table. In the Zoroastrian timeline, that second 3,000-year block is when creation really fills out, step by step. The sky isn't just a dome anymore, it's given layers and functions. The waters aren't just a single primordial sea, they're differentiated into rivers, lakes, rain, underground flows. The earth unfolds into distinct regions, plants spread, animals diversify, humans appear and start building communities. But all of this happens under invasion conditions. That's the key twist. Matter is not neutral, it's a vehicle for growth and a vector for harm at the same time. Every new layer of complexity that Ahura Mazda brings into being creates a new opportunity, either for Asher to express itself more fully, or for the Druge to find another foothold. So when later texts list the creations in order, sky, water, earth, plants, animals, humans, fire, they're not just reciting a cosmic inventory. They're outlining where the battle can be fought. Take the elements. The sky is imagined as a kind of crystal shell, holding back the darkness and the demons. When it's intact, it's the world's armour. When it's pierced by the attack, that's how disease, drought and chaos start filtering in. Clouds, smoke, storms. These aren't just weather. They're signs that the boundary is under stress. Water is created as a pure, life-giving force. In ideal form, it carries Asher, health, fertility, cleansing. But once mixture sets in, water becomes one of the most vulnerable things. It can be polluted by corpses, by waste, by demonic influence. That's why later Zoroastrian rules are almost obsessive about not contaminating rivers and wells. Polluting water isn't just dirty, it's treasonous. The earth itself is supposed to be stable, well-ordered land. In the pure blueprint, it's a harmonious platform for life. Under mixture, it can be cracked by Angra Mainyu's assault, infested with noxious creatures, used as a dumping ground for decay. The world becomes a patchwork, some regions aligned more closely with Asher, ordered, fertile, productive others, more under the shadow of the lie barren, chaotic, infested. This is where the idea of cosmic geography comes in. Later tradition imagines the world divided into zones or regions, some closer to the ideal centre, others more exposed to hostile forces. Mountains serve as anchors, rivers as veins, the stars and constellations as guardians posted along the perimeter. You get this image of the universe as a fortified city, walls, gates, watchtowers, inner sanctums of purity and outer districts under constant siege. Within that city, sacred order isn't some mystical abstraction. It's a very practical grid of what should be where, doing what. Fire belongs on the altar, or in the hearth, not in a rubbish heap. Water belongs flowing clean, not stagnant and foul. Earth should support crops and grazing, not rotting flesh. Animals have proper uses and treatments. Some are allies of Asher, others are framed as allies of the Druj, parasites, vermin, predators that embody corruption or excess. You can see how ethics starts to look like ecology. Every piece of the environment is classified, not just as useful or harmful, but as leaning toward truth or toward the lie. To align with Asher is to put things in their right place and keep them there. To side with Angra Mainyu is to blur categories, mix what should be separate, let corruption spread. That's why purity and pollution become such big themes. Again, if you only read this through a modern lens, it can sound like superstition or anxiety about germs before people knew what germs were. But Zoroastrian texts are working with a broader idea. Purity isn't just about physical cleanliness. It's about preserving the original pattern of the world against the encroachment of the lie. A corpse is the classic example. The moment life leaves a body, the forces of decay move in. In Zoroastrian thinking, that decay is the visible face of Angra Mainyu's work. Leave a corpse in the wrong place, and you're letting that influence seep into the soil, into the water, into the air. Handle it with the prescribed care, and you're containing the damage, cooperating with Ahura Mazda's side to prevent further spread. The same logic applies to how you treat fire. Fire is a direct manifestation of truth and clarity. Letting it be contaminated with waste, or using it carelessly, isn't just disrespectful. It's a kind of sabotage. Keeping fire pure is a mini reenactment of keeping the sky clear, the world defended. Now, one crucial caveat. The exact rituals, the details of how you keep water pure, or how you treat a corpse, vary across time, texts, and communities. There isn't one timeless manual that everyone followed word for word from the Achaemenid period to modern Parsi practice. What's consistent is the framework. Material things are morally charged. Actions that maintain order reinforce Asher. Actions that blur boundaries or spread decay give the Druj more room to work. This is where time itself starts to feel different. In the pure pre-invasion phase, time is almost an empty container. The spiritual blueprint exists in a kind of suspended perfection. Once mixture begins, time becomes a weapon and a cure. Ahura Mazda, in these traditions, chooses to limit the duration of the mixture. That 9,000-year stretch from invasion to renovation is finite by design. Time is the arena in which Angra Mainyu is allowed to operate, and also the thing that will eventually run out on him. Mortality plugs into that. The first human prototype, Gayamad, is immortal in the blueprint. Under invasion conditions, he's killed. His death is a disaster, but it's also the way mortality gets woven into the plan. Humans will now be born, live, die, and be replaced by new humans. That sounds like a concession to the enemy. Fine, death exists, but in the 12,000-year scheme it becomes a way to cycle more souls through the test. Every generation is another round of choices, more chances for alignment with Asher, more opportunities to push back against the lie. Time in this sense is like the evolutionary bottleneck we talked about earlier, but moral instead of genetic. Pressure is applied. Those who bend toward truth strengthen the long-term trajectory of the world. Those who side with the lie may flourish briefly, but they're operating under a countdown they can't see. So death isn't just punishment, it's also a tool. It limits how long corruption can cling to any one body, and it sets up the conditions for resurrection and renovation at the end of the story. The same clock that makes suffering possible also guarantees that suffering is temporary. All of this feeds into what you could call Zoroastrian ethical ecology. Your daily actions, how you handle water, how you speak, how you treat animals, how you dispose of waste, how you keep your body and mind, are not private, spiritual hygiene. They are maintenance tasks on a besieged fortress. Rituals from this angle are repair and defense operations on the fabric of the world. Speak truthfully and you're strengthening Asher's presence in the human sphere. Lie, and you're literally feeding Druge, who in some texts is personified as a parasite that grows on falsehood. Treat a dog, seen as a protector and helper, well, and you're backing up the side that guards the borders. Abuse it, and you're siding with the invaders. Not every Zoroastrian community interpreted each symbol the same way, and not every rule was enforced in the same spirit. But the deep pattern holds. In the mixture phase, the physical, biological, and social worlds are all woven into a single contested system. There is no clean separation between nature, ritual, and ethics. They're three faces of the same struggle. By the end of this second 3,000-year block, the stage is fully set. The material world is populated, differentiated, and deeply compromised. Time is ticking, mortality is universal. The tools for resistance, purity practices, truthful speech, ritual maintenance are in place, but something is missing. You have a battleground and a rule book. What you don't yet have is a fully awakened human partner who understands the plan and can articulate it. That's where the next phase comes in. The appearance of the first humans as conscious moral agents, and eventually the prophet who will name the war for what it is, and tilt the balance. In the Zoroastrian storyline, that first human prototype, Geomard, is only the beginning. In some versions he's an almost abstract figure, radiant, gigantic, standing at the centre of the world as a kind of spiritual, physical junction point. In others he's a more concrete first man, still ideal but recognisably human. Either way, his job is not to found a village, plant crops and have kids. His job is to be the first point of contact between Ahura Mazda's design and the vulnerability of matter under attack. And he dies. That's not a side note. Geomard's death under Angra Mainyu's onslaught is the moment where the plan takes a sharp turn. The perfect, immortal man in the blueprint is struck down, but from his dead body, new life emerges. Different texts tell it differently. Sometimes it's a plant that sprouts from his seed. Sometimes it's a rhubarb-like stalk holding the first human couple. Sometimes it's a more direct transformation. Names shift too. Mashya and Mashiane are often presented as the first male and female humans who actually live out the kind of lives we'd recognise. What they symbolise is pretty clear across the variations: origin, vulnerability, and choice under pressure. They're the first humans who aren't just symbolic junction points. They're exposed, they have bodies that can hunger, desire, fear. They can make mistakes. They can misunderstand. They can listen to the right voice or the wrong one. And the adversary knows exactly where to aim. If you think in terms of brute force, you might expect Angra Mainyu to keep doing what he did to Geomard: direct assault, physical destruction, wipe the experiment off the map. But the sources emphasize something subtler for the first true humans. The attack shifts from the body to the interface between perception and desire. In some later Middle Persian retellings, Mashya and Mashiane start out instinctively aligned with Ahura Mazda. They thank the good creator for their existence. They're oriented toward Asher by default. Then the lie intervenes. The demonic side whispers confusion. You weren't created by Ahura Mazda. You came from us. We are your true benefactors. Slowly, through repeated suggestion, their perception of reality is nudged off course. This is crucial. The enemy doesn't need to build an alternative universe. He just has to corrupt their picture of this one. Once their perception tilts, desire follows. Instead of gratitude to the good creator, they start feeling loyalty to the wrong side. Instead of seeing the world as a trust to be protected, they see it as something to exploit under demonic patronage. In some accounts, they explicitly pledge themselves to Angra Mainyu before eventually repenting. The point isn't the exact dialogue, it's the mechanism. The first human choice is a choice about who to believe. Perception, desire, disorder, that's the triangle the adversary works with. Perception. If you can be made to misread the world, call the good bad and the bad good, then almost everything that follows will be skewed, however sincere you are. Desire. If what you want can be tugged away from alignment with Asher, then even true beliefs will be constantly undermined by craving, resentment, pride. Disorder. Once enough misperception and misdirected desire accumulate in a community, social and ecological order start to unravel. Boundaries blur, ritual breaks down. Purity laws seem optional or oppressive. The maintenance of the fortress stops feeling urgent, and the gaps in the wall get bigger. The myth of the first humans concentrates that whole process into a single generation so we can see it clearly. On the surface, it's a story about a primeval couple being deceived. Underneath, it's a template. Every human life after them is going to replay that same drama, not in a pristine garden, but in villages, markets, households, empires. Will you see the world correctly? Will you direct your desire toward what truly participates in Asher? Or will you drift into Druge's gravitational pull? That's where the timeline really needs participants. Up to this point, you can tell the whole story in cosmic terms. Light versus darkness, order versus chaos, a fortified world under siege. With Mashia and Mashiane and their descendants, the story starts to localize. The battlefield moves into speech, habits, contracts, marriages, inheritance disputes, farming techniques. The cosmic plan becomes personal and social. In some traditions, the first humans are explicitly told their tasks: worship the good spirits, care for cattle, cultivate the earth, multiply, and stay faithful to Ahura Mazda. In others, it's more implied. Either way, their daily work is framed as participation in a much larger strategy. Farming the soil is not just about food, it's continuing creation under invasion. Protecting livestock is not just economics, it's guarding one of Asher's key allies against predatory and demonic forces. Once you see that, you can see why the adversary doesn't just go after their beliefs or their private desires. He goes after order itself. Disorder in this worldview is not random mess. It's the slow, cumulative breakdown of a pattern. Language gets sloppy, promises become unreliable, marriage rules blur, rituals get rushed or abandoned, treatment of animals and elements becomes careless. Each little deviation looks trivial in isolation. Over generations it adds up to a drift away from the original alignment. Here's where the reset resonance shows up. Zoroastrian texts don't talk about endless cycles of destruction and recreation in the same way some Indian or Greek systems do. The 12,000-year plan is fundamentally linear. One arc from pure creation, through mixture, to final renovation. But within that line, you can feel cyclical pressure building. Corruption doesn't just appear and sit there, it spreads. It infects institutions, customs, even the way people imagine the gods. The first humans, in one sense, start that process by letting the lie into their perception. Their descendants amplify it. Over millennia, you get a world where the original instructions are half-remembered or heavily distorted. At that point, a cleansing or restoration isn't just possible, it's necessary if the plan is going to reach its intended end. So when later Zoroastrian tradition talks about the future saviors, the Saoshyants, and the final Frashokereti as a kind of cosmic renovation. It's working with a logic that began with those first faltering human choices. The reset at the end isn't a rage quit and restart. It's a thorough repair of a system that has been slowly compromised since the very first misalignment of perception and desire. One important nuance, though: the sources don't all tell this story the same way, or with the same emphasis. Early Gothic hymns are more elusive. They focus on the choice between truth and the lie, the two mentalities or spirits, and invite each listener to decide. Later Middle Persian texts, like the Bundahishn or the Denkard, flesh out the mythic biographies of Gaiomard, Mashia and Mashiane in much more detail. Even among those later works, there are differences in how literally the episodes are framed, how harshly the first humans are judged, and how directly their failure is tied to historical decline. What's consistent is the narrative function. The appearance of primordial humans marks the point where the cosmic dualism of Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu is translated into lived moral psychology. The lie is no longer just out there in a demonic realm. It's in the gap between what you see and what's actually real, between what you want and what you ought to want, between the order written into the world and the disorder you let slide. From here on, the timeline isn't just a myth about gods and spirits. It's a schedule for human responsibility. The plan depends on people who can recognize the pattern, correct their perception, discipline their desires, and rebuild order in their corner of the world. And in the Zoroastrian retelling, the moment that recognition becomes fully conscious, fully articulated, is still in the future of our story. It arrives with a particular human being in a particular historical window, announcing that the moral experiment has been going on all along and that the clock is already deep into its second half. In Zoroastrian timekeeping, that particular human being has a name: Zarathustra. He's not just another prophet who shows up to remind people to be nice to each other. In the 12,000-year scheme, he marks the hinge of history. The third 3,000-year block is sometimes simply called the time of Zarathustra, because his revelation is treated as the decisive clarification of what has really been going on since the moment the lie first got a foothold in human perception. Up to him, you've got a world of mixture, truth and lie entangled in institutions, rituals, stories, and daily habits. People can still align with Asher, still worship Ahura Mazda, still choose well. But it's like trying to navigate a landscape where the signposts have been graffitied and half the maps are forgeries. You might feel vaguely that some things are good and some are bad, but you can't see clearly how it all fits into a single coherent strategy. Zarathustra's message, as tradition remembers it, is that the fog is over. His hymns, the Gathas, are obsessed with one core move, forcing a binary choice. Two primal mentalities, two paths, two camps. You can no longer float in the grey zone of inherited custom. You have to decide who you're with. In terms of the cosmic timetable, that's what his revelation does. It turns a background, half-understood conflict into a conscious, articulated front line. Clarity first. He names the stakes. The world is not a playground for random gods. It's a contested domain where every thought, word and deed tips the balance between Asher and Druge. That sounds abstract until you realize what it does to everyday life. Suddenly, lying in a business deal isn't just being clever. It's literally cooperating with the same principle that tried to annihilate creation in the first place. Feeding cattle, maintaining ritual purity, speaking truthfully, honoring contracts, these become acts of cosmic warfare on the side of Ahura Mazda. Then alignment. He gives people a way to orient. Instead of a vague sense of be good, Zarathustra's teaching lines up specific practices with the grain of reality, as Ahura Mazda intended it. Rituals are reinterpreted, not discarded. Sacrifices that look like they feed violent or deceptive forces are rejected or reframed. The divine beings, the Yazatars, are sorted. Which of them genuinely embody Asher, and which are human misunderstandings or outright demonic counterfeits? In historical terms, this looks like religious reform. In the 12,000-year plan, it's more like cleaning and resetting the instruments on the bridge of a ship that's been drifting off course for millennia. And then mobilization. He tells people their time window. Zarathustra doesn't just say, "There's a struggle, do your best." Later Zoroastrian tradition places him at a specific point in the cosmic schedule, at the start of the third 3,000-year phase. That's not just numerology, it's a way of saying, you're not at the beginning of the story, and you're not at the end. You're entering the phase where humans can finally fight back effectively, because they finally understand the rules of the game. Now, historically, when did this actually happen? That's where things get messy. Modern scholars, working from linguistic evidence and comparative history, usually place Zarathustra somewhere between roughly 1500 and 1000 BCE, most likely in eastern Iran or Central Asia. But traditional Zoroastrian chronologies often put him much earlier, or anchor him relative to later kings. One late scheme has him 258 years before Alexander the Great. Others slot him thousands of years back to fit neatly into the 12,000-year structure. So on the one hand, you've got a probably Bronze or early Iron Age religious reformer. On the other hand, you've got a cosmic timekeeper who appears exactly where the mythic calendar needs a decisive turn. Those might be the same figure, layered with legend, or as some scholars suggest, later priests may have retro-engineered dates and genealogies to weave a respected historical teacher into a pre-existing schematic timeline. The sources don't let us settle that with certainty. What matters for the timeline itself is less the exact year and more the function he serves. With Zarathustra, prophecy and ethics fuse. He doesn't only predict what will happen, he states what must be done. When he talks about the end, or about the fate of souls after death, he's not offering neutral, future interest trivia. He's using the structure of time, the promise of judgment, the assurance of final renovation, to pressure choices in the present. The calendar becomes a moral instrument. You can feel this in the way the Gathas speak directly to the listener. Choose between the two paths now before it's too late. The timeline isn't a passive countdown, it's a call to action. Every year of that third 3,000-year period is framed as an opportunity to shift the balance. Human beings, once merely participants in the experiment, are now explicitly addressed as co-workers of Ahura Mazda, foot soldiers and stewards with a definite campaign window. There's also a subtle but important shift in how the future is imagined. Zarathustra, in the oldest layers, already speaks of some figure or figures who will complete what he's begun. Future helpers of the good cause, restorers, victors. Later tradition will turn those into the Saoshyants, a sequence of saviour figures spaced out across the last 3,000 years of the plan. But even before those details crystallize, the basic pattern is present. Revelation is not a one-off event that solves everything at once. It's the start of a sustained offensive, so the third 3,000-year block becomes the age of the message and its unfolding consequences. Zarathustra is the first decisive clarifier. After him, according to later doctrine, you'll get other world-renewing agents, each pushing the process further toward Frashokereti. The turning of the tide is real, but it's not instantaneous. It's like a massive tanker starting to pivot. You feel the change in direction long before the ship is facing a new heading. By the time you reach the last 3,000 years in this scheme, you're no longer asking, will good win? That's settled in the logic of the system. The question is, how will the victory be realized, and what role do specific generations play in the lead-up? Zarathustra answers the first part by insisting that truth, right order, and wise rule are not optional accessories. They're the very tools by which the world will be repaired. The later saviour traditions pick up the second part, distributing that repair work across a series of climactic figures and crises. The result is a timeline where revelation isn't just a point in the past. It's the engine driving the rest of the story forward, all the way to the final renovation that still lies ahead in the narrative. In that framework, the idea of a Saoshyant is almost overdetermined. If you set up a universe where time is finite, conflict is bounded, and every phase has a particular job, then the last phase needs something like a closer. Not a random miracle that drops from the sky, but a figure whose whole identity is bound to the fact that the clock is almost out and the final moves have to be made with precision. Saoshyant itself basically means benefactor or one who brings benefit, not Messiah in the later loaded sense. In the oldest layers, it's more of a title than a proper name, more a role than a single superhero. A Saoshyant is a world helper, someone whose actions tip entire communities, or eventually the whole creation decisively toward Asher. But once you plug that role into a 12,000-year storyline, it gets sharpened. In the early period, help can look like clarification, like Zarathustra turning the lights on in a confused moral landscape. As you approach the end, help starts to look like rescue, repair, and finally, completion. The same word begins to shade from teacher and reformer toward restorer and finisher. The timeline itself pushes the concept in that direction. And here's where multiplicity comes in. Popular summaries sometimes talk as if Zoroastrianism has a single end-time hero called the Saoshyant, full stop. The actual traditions are more layered. By late antique times, many Zoroastrian texts don't imagine one saviour, but three major Saoshyants are rising in sequence during the final 3,000-year block, each one born from Zarathustra's seed, each one pushing the process further. The first appears after long decline, reviving the practice of the religion and restoring some lost order. The second carries that process further, intensifying justice, realigning kingship, tightening the bond between right worship and right governance. The third, often singled out with the title Astvatereta, he who embodies righteousness, is the one who presides over the final renovation, the Frashokereti. Think of it less like one superhero showing up for a last-minute save, and more like a relay race. The baton is revelation. Zarathustra receives it and runs his leg, then passes it down the centuries. Each Saoshyant in the late schema takes that same revelation and applies it under more extreme conditions, in a world where the stakes are higher and the options narrower. Why would later priests and storytellers multiply these figures instead of consolidating everything into one perfect saviour? Because in a time-bounded battle, the end isn't just a point, it's a process. If you've committed yourself to a 12,000-year script, you can't have a totally flat last act. The closer you get to the finish, the more you need a sense of escalation. More distortion, more suffering, sharper moral choices, and in response, more concentrated forms of help. Multiplying Saoshyants lets the tradition imagine waves of renewal, each one stronger than the last, tracking with the increasing intensity of the conflict. And that conflict does intensify. In these later texts, the final 3,000 years are not a gentle glide into utopia. They're described as a time of deepening deception, failing empires, corrupt priesthoods, environmental stress, and social breakdown. It's the mixture phase, but in overdrive, the lie doesn't just operate in the background, it goes on a last, desperate offensive. You can feel the logic. If Drew has a fixed time window, it's going to squeeze every advantage out of its last millennia. That means misinformation, false leaders, fake miracles, and systems that reward short-term benefit over long-term truth. The world doesn't simply get more evil in an abstract way, it gets more confusing. Distinguishing Asher from Druj becomes harder, not easier. So the Saoshyants aren't just miracle workers, they're clarity makers under maximum pressure. As the end approaches, their job description expands. They're expected to restore forgotten knowledge, re-establish proper rituals, unmask impostors, bring hidden injustices to light. In some accounts, they literally raise the dead or participate in the resurrection process. In others, they catalyze the final judgment by exposing what people actually chose during the long experiment of history. This is where the moral sorting comes in. Zoroastrian eschatology always had a judgment motif, the Chinvat bridge, where souls pass after death, weighed by their thoughts, words and deeds. In the late-stage imagination, the work of the Saoshyants helps bring that individual logic into the open on a collective scale. Whole societies are, in effect, tested. Who aligns with the restorers of Asher, and who doubles down on the lie? The end times, then, are not just about punishment for the bad and reward for the good. They're about revealing what each person, each community, has actually become over the long arc. The intensifying conflict forces choices out of the grey zone. That's the moral function of a shrinking timeline. It compresses ambivalence. This is also where modern, oversimplified comparisons can mislead. You'll often hear that the Saoshyant is the Zoroastrian Messiah, as if we could draw a straight line from late antique Iranian priests to, say, Christian or Islamic end-time figures. There are parallels, but they aren't one-to-one. For one thing, the Saoshyant is operating inside a finite pre-planned cosmic schedule, anchored in a dualist metaphysics. The victory of good is not in doubt. What's at stake is how and through whom it becomes fully realized. For another, the multiplicity of saviors and their genealogical link to Zarathustra give the figure a distinct profile. He's not a wholly new revelation, but the final flowering of an old one. And while later Jewish, Christian and Islamic traditions developed powerful messianic and Mahdi concepts of their own, the direction of influence is hard to map in detail. Most scholars today are comfortable saying that Zoroastrian ideas about resurrection, judgment and world renovation probably contributed to the wider religious atmosphere of the Near East, especially during the Achaemenid and Sasanian periods when Iranian and Western Asian cultures were deeply entangled. But that's a far cry from claiming X doctrine was copied from Zoroastrianism. It's safer to imagine a shared conversation space, where Iranian notions of a finite history, final helpers, and a renovated world were in the mix alongside Babylonian, Jewish, Greek, and later Christian and Islamic speculations. Terms shift, images migrate, concepts get reinterpreted. What stays distinctive in the Zoroastrian version is the timetable and the logic behind it. The Saoshyants are not wildcards thrown into an open-ended cosmos. They're scheduled reinforcements in a war whose outcome has already been decided at the level of principle, but still has to be played out in time. Their help is final, not because it appears out of nowhere, but because it arrives at the precise moment when the long experiment of mixture has run its course and all that's left is to separate, judge, and renew. Which raises the next question in the story. If the last 3,000 years are structured around this escalating conflict and these climactic helpers, what does that period actually look like? How does a world on the verge of Frashokereti behave? And how did ancient Iranians think they'd know they were living in that pressure zone? In later Zoroastrian imagination, those last 3,000 years are not a vague fog at the end of the calendar. They're mapped, textured, filled with recognizable patterns. The world doesn't just end, it frays. The descriptions cluster around a handful of motifs you'll recognize from apocalyptic literature all over the place. but with their own Iranian flavour. Social order starts to unravel. Justice systems fail, or worse, become tools of injustice. Kings rule badly or don't rule at all. Thieves and liars prosper. Honest people are sidelined. Families fracture. Children turn on parents. Siblings betray one another. Elders are disrespected. The basic kinship bonds that had been the glue of early human society are depicted as coming under strain. Morally, the picture is one of confusion rather than cartoon villainy. The texts talk about people no longer knowing good from evil, or calling evil good and good evil. Rituals are neglected or altered. The correct performance of worship is forgotten or replaced by convenient shortcuts. Priests become greedy or corrupt, more interested in fees than in truth. It's not that everyone suddenly wants to do the worst possible thing. It's that the alignment between what's beneficial in the short term and what's aligned with Asher breaks down entirely. And over all of this hangs the theme of deception. In a universe where Druge is literally the lie, end times pressure means an escalation of lying. False teachers, false revelations, false miracles, stories that sound pious on the surface, but quietly direct people away from the real thing. In some versions, rival saviours show up ahead of the real Saoshyants, attracting followings, performing signs, but ultimately reinforcing the lie. The closer you get to the end, the more plausible the counterfeits become. Notice what that does to the experience of living in that age. It's not just more suffering, it's more ambiguity. It's harder to know who to trust, which institutions to believe, which traditions are still authentic, and which have been hollowed out. The last 3,000 years are imagined as an epistemic crisis. The external world is still functioning. People farm, trade, go to war, but inside that world, the signal-to-noise ratio collapses. From a narrative standpoint, this isn't just pessimism. It's setup. If the cosmos is heading toward Frashokereti, toward a thorough renovation and clarification, then the run-up almost has to be a period of maximum murk. You can't make Revelation meaningful unless it's breaking into a genuine fog. You can't make renovation feel necessary unless the existing order is obviously wearing thin. That's the logic behind the decline. The tradition doesn't imagine a universe where Ahura Mazda suddenly decides to fix a basically fine world because the timer dinged. It's a universe where the long experiment of mixture is allowed to play out to the point where its inherent contradictions are impossible to ignore. Systems built on half-truths and self-interest don't just offend a divine planner, they collapse under their own weight. The social unravelling isn't just punishment, it's consequence made visible, and then, against that backdrop, the Saoshyants matter more. If you lived in a golden age of clear morals, honest leaders, and unbroken rituals, a world restorer would be nice but optional. In a world where trust has eroded, memory has frayed, and deception has gone high-tech, in however you imagine that the same figure becomes essential. The texts lean into this. The helpers of the last age don't arrive as a decorative flourish. They arrive because the situation has become unsustainable without radical intervention. Now, if you spent any time around other apocalyptic traditions, you're already hearing echoes. Lists of signs of the end, social breakdown, disrespect for elders, corrupt rulers, failing crops, religious hypocrisy show up in Jewish apocalyptic writings, in later Christian sermons about the last days, in Islamic hadith collections that catalogue pre-Mahdi symptoms of decay, in Indian discussions of the Kali Yuga. Scholars have noticed the family resemblance for a long time. But resemblance is not the same as a simple borrowing chart. Ancient Iran was not a sealed bubble. Iranian, Mesopotamian, Jewish, Greek, and later Christian and Islamic thinkers shared political spaces and intellectual concerns. Ideas about final judgment, resurrection, and a last crisis circulated in that larger environment. It would be surprising if nobody influenced anybody. At the same time, many of these end signs are, in a sense, low-hanging fruit. If you ask what would it look like if society were really going wrong, most human cultures will point to similar things: injustice, broken families, religious corruption, ecological stress, proliferating lies. You don't need a copying hypothesis for that. You just need a shared sense of what a healthy world looks like and how it can fail. Where the Zoroastrian version keeps its distinctive shape is in how those signs are plugged into the 12,000-year script and how they can be read. On the one hand, the late texts absolutely talk about concrete events, wars, invasions, famines, climate disturbances. On the other hand, many of the signs have a built-in ethical dimension. They describe states of character and patterns of behavior. People losing shame, abandoning truth, hoarding wealth, despising the poor, treating sacred things as trivial. That opens up a different way to use them. Instead of treating the sign lists as a checklist for predicting calendar dates, this many earthquakes, that many bad kings, you can read them as a moral diagnostic. They're less like a weather forecast and more like a doctor's description of a terminal disease. When you see this cluster of symptoms, the tradition is saying, you know, the illness of Druge has penetrated deeply into the body of the world. Some modern Zoroastrian thinkers lean into this ethical reading. They'll say whether or not we're literally in the final 3,000 years, these patterns of decline are always possible. They describe what happens whenever truth is systematically devalued and short-term advantage rules. In that sense, signs of the end become a mirror communities can hold up to themselves, not a secret code for doomsday timing. And even in the more concrete predictive strands, the horizon is not permanent ruin. This is one of the biggest differences between the Zoroastrian arc and a lot of popular apocalyptic imagination today. The story is not, things get worse and worse forever until everything is burned up and we escape to somewhere else. The story is, things get worse and worse until the lie has exhausted its allotted time, is exposed for what it is, and is finally removed so that the original good creation can be restored. The pressure of the end time exists precisely because the cosmos is heading toward restoration, not because it's spiraling into endless darkness. The last 3,000 years are depicted as heavy, confusing, even terrifying, but they're part of a finite, meaningful sequence that culminates in Frashokereti, the Renovation, to see what that actually looks like in Zoroastrian thought, how a broken world is melted down, sorted, and remade without being scrapped. We have to follow the story one step further, into the images of judgment and renewal that sit at the very end of the 12,000-year plan. Frashokereti is the name Zoroastrianism gives to that renovation. The word itself comes from an Avestan root, meaning something like making wonderful again, making fresh, bringing to perfection. It's not delete world, start new file. It's take the existing file, strip out every virus, restore the original data, and then lock it against corruption forever. So when you hear people describe it as a reset, that's only half right. There is a reset-like moment in the story, a point where the old way of operating ends decisively. But it is not a restart of the cycle. It's a one-time renovation that fulfills the entire 12,000-year script. That distinction matters. In a lot of cosmologies we'll be looking at later in this video, the universe runs on loops. Ages of the world succeed one another in repeating patterns. Golden Age, Silver Age, Decline, Catastrophe, New Golden Age, and so on. The clock turns over. Humanity gets another shot under slightly different conditions, but the basic rhythm repeats. Zoroastrian Frashokereti is not like that. From the earliest layers of the tradition we can still glimpse, the storyline isn't round and round we go. It's Creation starts in a perfect non-mixed state, gets invaded, enters a long experiment of mixture, and then, once is cleaned and fixed so that mixture never returns. Time is an arrow, not a wheel. What happens at the target of that arrow is surprisingly specific. In the classic summaries of later Middle Persian texts, Frashokereti is the moment when Ahura Mazda's side wins so completely that the very conditions for evil disappear. Angra Mainyu isn't just beaten back to his corner to try again next cycle. He is rendered permanently ineffective. The lie loses not just the current battle, but its ability to mount new campaigns at all. Perfection in this scheme isn't some abstract heavenly cloud realm. It's this world, this material creation, brought back into full alignment with Asher. That means the end state is not spiritualized escape. It's a renewed cosmos. Humans rise from the dead, bodies and all. Animals return. The sky, earth, waters and plants are all present. What changes is that everything operates without the distortions introduced during the age of mixture. No more disease, no more decay, no more predators tearing prey apart in fear and pain. No more ignorance about what is good. No more internal tug of war between wanting the right thing and craving the wrong thing. The renovation is described in the language of purification and transformation. Later sources talk about metals in the mountains flowing over the earth, like a river or sea of molten metal. We'll come back to that imagery in the next section, because it's become one of the most famous and most misunderstood pictures of Zoroastrian judgment. But even before you get to that specific symbol, the logic is already in place. Impurities aren't simply thrown away. They're burned out, separated, neutralized. Creation isn't discarded like a failed project. It's refined like ore in a furnace. The same elements remain, but now they're in their proper, perfected configuration. Individual humans go through a similar process. Throughout the tradition you get the sense that no one is simply annihilated as useless scrap. The wicked suffer, the righteous are vindicated, there is judgment and consequence. But the end goal is not to maintain an eternal, equal and opposite kingdom of torment to balance the kingdom of joy. The end goal is a unified, restored creation. Some later Zoroastrian theologians lean into the idea that, at the very last, even the most contaminated souls are purified, that the pain of the final melting down is remedial, not vindictive. Not everyone in the tradition would phrase it exactly that way, and the sources don't speak with a single voice. But what they share is this. The renovation is about removal of evil from the structure of reality, not the preservation of evil as a permanent exhibit. That's what makes the 12,000-year timeline teleological. It isn't just measuring out episodes of cosmic drama, it's charting progress toward a defined endpoint. Creation has an intended state. The mixture ages are not random wandering, they're a test and a theatre, in which truth and lie, order and chaos, play out until the lie has exhausted its options. History, in this view, is not just things that happen, it's the medium through which a cosmic intention is brought to completion. The three great 3,000-year phases, blueprint, mixture and decisive struggle, aren't just arbitrary slices. They're steps in a plan whose last chapter is already known in outline form. There will be a final saviour or saviours. There will be a last uprising of the lie. There will be judgment, and after that, a world in which the conditions for mixture no longer exist. Once you understand that teleological backbone, the more dramatic end-time images stop looking like random special effects and start reading as metaphors for a very precise claim, that the universe is heading toward a stable equilibrium in which good is not just temporarily on top, but structurally secured. That's also why, in Zoroastrian thought, you don't get endless cycles of world ages after Frashokereti. There's no need. The experiment has been run. Free moral agents have had their chance across millennia to choose sides, change sides, and test the consequences. The data are in. The final renovation simply fixes the result, locking in the alignment with Asher that was always the point. So when modern people talk about a reset, it's worth asking, reset to what? In the Zoroastrian case, the answer is clear. Not back to a primitive Eden with another lurking serpent. Not back to the beginning of yet another 12,000-year round. The reset is forward to a perfected version of the original good creation, in which the vulnerability that made invasion and mixture possible in the first place has been removed. The tradition then reaches for images to make that almost unimaginable transformation concrete. A world melted and remade, a river of fire that burns away only what shouldn't be there, the dead rising into bodies that no longer sicken. The earth itself cleansed so thoroughly that no trace of decay remains. Those images are powerful enough that they've travelled far beyond their original context, often stripped of the careful theology that shaped them, to see what they were trying to say and what they weren't. We need to look closely at one of the most vivid scenes attached to Frashokereti, that river of molten metal and the final judgment it represents. In the later Zoroastrian texts, that river of molten metal shows up at the climactic moment. After the dead have been raised, after the last Saoshyant has appeared, after the final showdown with the forces of the lie. Then comes this. Metals in the mountains melt, run together and pour over the earth like a blazing flood. Every human being has to pass through it. It's described in different ways depending on the source. Sometimes it's a river you walk through. Sometimes it's a sea that covers the whole world so nothing can escape. Sometimes it's linked directly to the sun, as if the light itself has become liquid and unbearably intense. But the core idea is stable, a universal ordeal that no one can bypass. Here's the twist that makes it more than just an ancient horror image. In the classic Pahlavi summaries, the righteous experience this molten metal as something like warm milk. It doesn't scorch or consume them. It feels pleasant, even gentle. The wicked, by contrast, feel it as searing torment. They scream and burn and are forced to confront everything in themselves that does not belong in a perfected world. Same event, same river, totally different experience. That detail is crucial for understanding how Zoroastrian thought imagines judgment. Judgment, in this picture, isn't a kind of cosmic sorting hat that sends people to one of two static locations. Heave heaven over here, hell over there, based on an external checklist. It's an encounter with reality so intense that your inner alignment to Asher, or to the lie, becomes your fate. If your thoughts, words and deeds have trained you toward truth, the flood of truth is joy. If you've built your whole self around deception, exploitation and cruelty, the sudden impossibility of hiding, the inability to cling to those patterns, is agony. The river doesn't change depending on who you are. You change how you meet it. The metal image also carries a very specific theological signal. Zoroastrian priests knew metalwork. They understood ore, slag, and refining. When you smelt ore, you don't throw away the whole thing. You separate the valuable from the useless, burn out the contaminants, and end up with something more pure, more itself. Fire is destructive to the dross, not to the gold. So when they talk about a river of molten metal, they're not picturing a gratuitous torture device. They're picturing a world-scale smelting process. Creation is the ore. Human history has filled it with mixtures, truth and lie, justice and injustice, loyalty and betrayal, all fused together. Frashokereti is the moment when that ore goes into the furnace for the last time. Everything that can harmonize with Asher survives, clarified. Everything that can't, doesn't. That's why many later theologians emphasize that the pain of the wicked in that river is not the goal. It's a side effect of the separation process. The goal is a clean, unified cosmos. The suffering happens because there are real consequences to having attached yourself over a lifetime to patterns that can't exist in that final state. It's judgment as moral physics. You could also think of it as a truth serum turned up to infinity. All illusions burn off, self-deception fails, no spin, no propaganda, no clever excuses. The river isn't impressed. It simply reveals and resolves. Now, how literally did ancient Zoroastrians take this? The honest answer is it depends which Zoroastrians, when and where. Some later texts talk about the molten metal in very concrete terms. Mountains literally melt. The river literally covers the earth up to a person's height. People literally feel heat or comfort, depending on their moral state. Taken at face value, that's a straightforward apocalyptic physics lesson. But the same tradition, sometimes in the same books, slips immediately into metaphorical language. The river is the blazing power of Asher. The heat is the intensity of insight into one's own deeds. The melting is the dissolving of the mixed, half-hearted self into something single-mindedly aligned with truth. Even within priestly commentary, you find both instincts. Yes, this will really happen. And also no, you shouldn't imagine it as just lava rolling down a hillside. Modern readers tend to fall into two opposite camps. On one side, you get highly literalist readings that treat the molten metal like a prediction of some future geological catastrophe or cosmic plasma event, sometimes even plugging it into modern reset narratives about solar flares or crustal displacement. The river becomes a kind of ancient sci-fi description of a physical cataclysm that wipes the slate clean. On the other side, you get hypersymbolic readings that flatten everything into inner psychology. The river is just a metaphor for feeling guilty. Judgment is nothing but becoming aware of your mistakes. There's no real cosmic event at all, just a shift in consciousness. Both of those approaches miss what makes the image specifically Zoroastrian. The tradition is not shy about cosmic events. Resurrection, the defeat of Angra Mainyu, the renovation of the material world, all of that is presented as actually happening in the theatre of creation, not just in people's heads. At the same time, the whole point of the molten metal scene is that moral orientation and cosmic reality are not separable. What happens out there is inseparable from what you have become in here. The judgment is not mere spectacle, it's moral reckoning embodied in a world-level transformation. So, when you ask, is the river literal or symbolic? The best Zoroastrian answer is something like, it's a real event described in the language of a symbol that already carries layers of meaning. Purification, testing, refinement. And because the sources themselves are not uniform, later interpreters have room to emphasize different aspects. Some lean into the fearsome side, turning the river into an incentive for obedience and a deterrent against sin. Others stress the remedial side, suggesting that, in the end, even the worst are purified by passing through it, that the fire burns away evil but does not preserve a permanent population of damned souls in agony. You can see why that last point is debated. If the final state of the world is wholly good, what happens to the conscious agents who chose evil? Are they annihilated? Do they eventually emerge purified, at the cost of terrible pain? Are some forever excluded? The texts gesture in different directions, and modern scholars argue about how to reconcile them. What they share, though, is this basic framework. Judgment is not God arbitrarily assigning outcomes. It is the final alignment of beings with the reality they themselves have been moving toward all along. The river of molten metal is the narrative way of saying that at the end of the 12,000-year plan, you can't fake your way into harmony with Asher. You either are the kind of person for whom truth is warmth, or you are the kind of person for whom truth feels like fire. And because this image is so vivid, it doesn't stay put. Pieces of it seep into neighbouring traditions. Echoes show up in later apocalyptic literature, in ideas of fiery judgment, in visions of the world being tested or renewed by flame. The specifics get blurred, the theology gets simplified, and the careful distinction between purification and vindictive punishment often disappears. To understand how those echoes travel into Greek thought, into Jewish and Christian apocalyptic, into modern talk of world-burning resets, we have to step out of purely Zoroastrian territory and watch how Persian ideas evolved under empires and encounters. That's where the timeline leaves mythic future and collides with actual historical periods. Achaemenids, Parthians, Sasanians, and the changing shape of doctrine in a very real, very political world. When we talk about a 12,000-year plan, it's tempting to float above history, stay in the safe zone of myth and theology. But Zoroastrianism didn't develop in a vacuum. It grew hardened and sometimes mutated inside actual empires, under kings who collected taxes, fought wars and worried about rebellions. Every time the political map of Iran shifted, the religious conversation shifted with it. So, quick arc. First, the Achaemenids, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, roughly 6th to 4th century BCE. This is the era of the big bilingual inscriptions carved into cliffs, the empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Then, after Alexander and a messy Hellenistic interlude, you get the Parthians, looser, more decentralized, often overshadowed in popular memory. But they ruled Iran for almost 5 centuries. Finally, the Sasanians, 3rd to 7th century CE, centralized, self-conscious, and very explicit about linking royal power to Mazda worship. These are the people who preside over the great compilations in Middle Persian, the Pahlavi books that give us the most detailed versions of the 12,000-year scheme. Why does that matter? Because our clearest evidence for the timeline, for the river of metal, for the sequence of ages and saviours, comes from texts written down and edited when Zoroastrianism was already an imperial priest-managed system. You can think of it like this. The Gathas, those early hymns attributed to Zarathustra, are like a raw data set, intense, poetic, focused on moral choice, cosmic struggle, devotion to Ahura Mazda. They hint at judgment, at resurrection, at the final victory of Ashur, but they don't hand you a neat 12,000-year calendar. Centuries later, under organized priesthoods and powerful dynasties, that raw data gets cleaned, sorted, and turned into a timeline. Sequences are fixed, ages are counted, events are placed in order. Everything becomes much more systematic. Imperial patronage is a big part of that story. If you're a king ruling a vast, diverse empire, a clear cosmic narrative is a political asset. You want a story that explains why your rule exists, why your enemies are not just inconvenient, but aligned with the lie, why supporting the official cult is literally cooperating with the victory of good over evil. Priests in that setting are not just religious specialists. They're curators of memory. They run schools. They copy texts. They debate between themselves which stories to emphasize and which to let fade. Under the Achaemenids, we're looking at a relatively early stage of that process. Darius at Behistun invokes Ahura Mazda, talks about the lie as something that causes rebellion and disorder. You can feel the dualism, truth versus falsehood, order versus chaos. But we don't yet see the fully articulated 12,000-year framework in the inscriptions themselves. That doesn't mean it didn't exist at all. It means that in the texts that survived from that period, the focus is on royal legitimacy and moral categories, not yet on exact cosmic scheduling. Meanwhile, somewhere below the level of monumental rock carvings, Priestly circles are preserving hymns, ritual formulas, narratives about creation and end time. Oral tradition is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Different regions might stress different pieces. Some emphasize sacrifice and purity laws. Others lean into eschatology. Then the political world fractures. Alexander comes through. The empire splinters. Hellenistic kingdoms rise and fall. Greek language and ideas flood into the Near East. Iranian elites start reading Plato and Aristotle while still offering sacrifice to Iranian gods. Under the Parthians, things are more federated. Local dynasts, regional cults, competing priestly lineages. We know frustratingly little in detail because the textual record is thinner, but this is almost certainly a period of experimentation. Some groups may have pushed the timeline theme harder, especially in apocalyptic circles that saw Greek or Roman domination as a sign that history was off the rails and needed divine correction. Others may have kept their focus more on ritual purity and less on cosmic countdown. What we do see by the late Parthian and early Sasanian period is an environment thick with polemics. Jews are writing apocalypses under foreign rule. Early Christians are arguing about resurrection, judgment, and the end of the age. Gnostic movements are spinning elaborate cosmic myths. Greek philosophers are speculating about world cycles and conflagrations. Manichaeans are building an aggressively dualist religion that claims to improve on both Christianity and Zoroastrianism. Iran sits right in the middle of all this. Ideas are crossing borders along with merchants and armies. When a Christian missionary debates a Zoroastrian priest at a Sasanian court, that's not just a one-off argument. It's a pressure event. Each side is forced to sharpen its own story. Who created the world? Why is there evil? How does it end? What happens to the dead? Under those conditions, doctrines don't just passively preserve themselves. They evolve, enter the Sasanians. From the 3rd century onward, you get rulers like Ardashir and Shapur, who present themselves as champions of Mazda worship and friends of the Magi. They reorganize the priesthood, sponsor fire temples, and, crucially, begin the project of collecting, editing, and standardizing inherited traditions. This is where the Avesta, which had been massively oral, starts to become a more fixed textual corpus, and around it, in Middle Persian prose, you get the big doctrinal syntheses, the Bundahishn, the Denkard, the apocalyptic books that lay out the 12,000 years in detail. Those compilations are not neutral snapshots. They're late antique constructions. Sasanian priests are looking back over centuries of lore and saying, in effect, let's organize this. Let's put creation, mixture, Zarathustra's appearance, the Saoshyants, and the final renovation into one coherent scheme. They're also responding to internal debates. If some groups downplay eschatology, the compilers double down and insist, no, resurrection is central. If others question how literally to take the final renewal, they spell it out. Bodies rise, metals melt, the world is perfected. And hovering in the background are very worldly anxieties. The Sasanians are locked in long, draining wars with Rome and then Byzantium. There are plagues, fiscal crises, provincial revolts. Later, there's the looming presence of a new, aggressive, monotheistic movement coming out of Arabia. In times like that, end-time thinking tends to intensify. Prophecies get reread. Old symbolic images start to look suspiciously like headlines. A bad harvest, a devastating war, a solar eclipse. Everything can be slotted into the last chapters of the cosmic script. But here's the key point for our purposes. The fact that Sasanian texts encode strong apocalyptic expectation doesn't mean their predictions came true in any straightforward way. What it shows is how political pressure can turn flexible, open-ended images, final victory, ultimate purification, justice for the dead, into tight timetables and very specific signs. The 12,000-year plan becomes less like a poetic framework, and more like a clock that people nervously check whenever history feels unstable. At the same time, the Sasanian world is a massive contact zone. Roman and Byzantine Christians bring their apocalypses. Syriac writers compose visions of fiery judgment that look, at times, suspiciously Persian. Jewish communities under Persian rule absorb and rework ideas of resurrection and angelic warfare. Manichaeans steal pieces from everywhere and export a Persian-flavoured dualism all the way to China. Concepts don't respect borders. A Zoroastrian river of molten metal can echo as Christian lake of fire. A 12,000-year scheme can resonate with Greek talk of cosmic cycles, or with Indian speculation about world ages. None of these are simple copy-and-paste events, but the overlaps are too patent to ignore. By the time the Sasanian Empire falls in the 7th century, the old Iranian timeline has already leaked into multiple traditions. It will continue to mutate inside Islamic thought, Jewish mysticism, Christian apocalyptics, and later occult and esoteric systems. So when modern reset narratives talk about periodic world burnings, scheduled renewals, or cosmic clocks ticking down to a clean slate, they're tapping into a reservoir that was deepened, not created, but intensified, structured, and exported under very specific historical conditions. To trace those connections, we now have to step outside Iran entirely and look sideways to India's Yugas, Mesopotamian king lists, Greek great years, and the end-time maps of the Abrahamic traditions, all of them grappling in their own way with the same question: is history a straight line to a final renovation, or a repeating cycle of rise, fall, and reset? When people today talk about a reset, they're usually not thinking like a Sasanian priest. They're thinking in loops. A golden age rises. It gets corrupted. A catastrophe wipes the slate clean. Survivors rebuild. The cycle starts again. Sometimes it's framed as cosmic solar flares, pole flips, galactic alignments. Sometimes it's framed as conspiratorial, shadow elites triggering collapses on a schedule. But underneath all the YouTube thumbnails and breathless blog posts, the basic template is simple. History runs in circles. Destruction is periodic. Resets are routine. That idea has deep mythic roots. You see it in talk of world ages, Yugas, suns, kalpas. You see it in myths where gods flood the world multiple times, burn it multiple times, reseed it multiple times. Time isn't a straight road with a clear destination. It's a wheel. It turns. If you miss this revolution, wait around. Another one will come. Zoroastrianism, at least in its classical form, is doing something different. Yes, it has ages. Yes, there is a final purification with fire and molten metal that sounds like a classic reset. Yes. Some late texts play with huge spans of time that feel almost cyclical. But at the core, the timeline is not a wheel. It's a line with a point of origin, a middle stretch of conflict, and a terminal renovation that doesn't loop back. Creation, mixture, resolution, beginning, struggle, definitive victory. Not beginning, struggle, partial cleanup, then back to beginning. That's a crucial distinction if you're trying to map reset cycles across cultures. Because if you're not careful, you start flattening everything into the same pattern. You hear 12,000 years and immediately think of some New Age graphic with sine waves of rising and falling consciousness. You hear renovation and mentally translate it into reboot or season 2 of the universe. You notice an Indian forage scheme or a Greek talk of cosmic conflagrations and go, "Ah, see?" Everyone knew about the same recurring catastrophe cycle. They just used different names. It feels neat. It feels connecting. But it can also be wildly misleading. What's going on is usually more subtle than outright sameness, and more structured than random coincidence. So how do you compare without collapsing everything into one giant reset myth? You need some clear axes. Think of it as a little diagnostic toolkit. 4 questions you can quietly ask every time someone claims that 2 world-age systems are basically the same. First, structure. Is time fundamentally linear or fundamentally cyclical in this system? Does it have a single creation event that never repeats, followed by one long, messy history, and then a once-for-all ending? That's the Zoroastrian model at its most classic. 4 phases of 3,000 years each. One cosmic drama. Or does it present multiple full runs of the cosmos, each with its own creation, its own decline, its own destruction, stacked on top of each other like layers? That's closer to some Hindu cosmologies, to certain Greek great year ideas, to Mesoamerican 5 suns myths. Zoroastrianism leans hard into structure as a one-off. The good creator makes a good world. The evil spirit invades. Time is the arena for cleaning up that mess. And when it's done, it's done. No second round, no fresh incursion, no new Angra Mainyu spawning after the last one is defeated. Second, moral logic. In a true cycle, does morality actually matter to the outcome? If ages just rise and fall because that's what ages do, like seasons, like tides, then your personal virtue might matter for your own fate, but it doesn't change the cosmic pattern. The world will decline and end on schedule, regardless of whether humans behave better or worse. In the Zoroastrian frame, moral choice is wired into the structure of time itself. Human decisions contribute to the victory of Asher or the strengthening of the lie. Your truth-telling, your ritual purity, your support of the right order are not just private habits. They literally help move the timeline toward the final renovation. That's not typical in simple cyclical schemes, where the universe resets because that's just what it does, like a clock spring unwinding. Third, mechanism of reset. When the world ends, what actually happens? Is there a physical disaster, a flood, a fire, a cosmic collision that wipes life off the map but leaves the basic world machine intact so it can run again? That's a classic reset model. The universe is like a game console that overheats. You turn it off, let it cool, turn it back on. Or is the end framed as a transformation of the entire ontological setup, a metaphysical upgrade where decay, death and deception are permanently removed from the system? Zoroastrian Frashokereti is much closer to the second. The molten metal, the judgment, the resurrection. These aren't just a purge before another round of the same. They're a reconfiguration of reality so that what made the previous struggle possible can never arise again. You don't cycle a perfected world back into a state of mixture. That would contradict the whole point. Fourth, endpoint. Does the story explicitly promise an end to time as we know it? In some traditions, ages repeat indefinitely, even if there's a sense of progress or decline across larger arcs. There's no final terminal event that closes the series for good. You might get unimaginably long Maha cycles, but theoretically they don't stop. In Zoroastrian eschatology, by contrast, the endpoint is clear. Evil is rendered powerless. The dead are raised. Bodies and souls are healed. The world is made fresh and enduring. Time, at least time as a battleground between truth and lie, ends. That finality is part of why Zoroastrian ideas slot so easily into later Abrahamic end-time maps. It's also why modern reset narratives, which usually assume the wheel keeps turning, are actually out of sync with the strict logic of Frashokereti, even when they borrow its imagery. Once you start running traditions through this little framework, structure, moral logic, mechanism, endpoint, You notice patterns and mismatches. Some myths really are about endless cycles where catastrophe is just a scheduled cleanup. Others are hybrids, cyclical on one scale, linear on another. And some, like the Zoroastrian 12,000-year scheme, are more like a staged play with a clear first scene and a definitive curtain call. In the next sections, we're going to look outward. India's Yugas, Mesopotamian king lists and floods, Greek talk of ages and cosmic fires, then Jewish, Christian and Islamic apocalypses that grew up in conversation with Iranian ideas. The goal isn't to force them all into one hidden reset calendar, or to pretend Persia invented every end-time image on Earth. It's to see how different cultures, facing different landscapes, empires and crises, reached for similar tools, ages, clocks, purges, renewals, to answer the same unnerving question. Is the world winding down toward a final resolution, or just going around and around and around? If you want to see what a full-blown cyclical worldview looks like, you go to India. By the time the classical Hindu texts are laying it out clearly, the structure is almost dizzying. You don't just get one age, you get four. Satya Yuga, the age of truth. Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga. Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel and decline. Together they make a Maha Yuga, a great age, and that Maha Yuga doesn't just happen once. It repeats again and again, nested inside, still larger cycles, Manvantaras and Kalpas, so big that the lifetimes of gods are just ticks on the cosmic clock. Each of the four yugas has a moral profile. At the beginning, in Satya, Dharma, cosmic order, right conduct, is said to stand on four legs. The world is stable, truthful, luminous. As the yugas roll on, Dharma loses a leg each time. By the time you reach Kali, it's down to one. Violence, deception, greed, and confusion dominate. Lifespans shrink, virtue is rare, and the sense is not that history is progressing, but that it's wearing out. This is a moral decline pattern baked into the fabric of time. People don't ruin the age is already tilted. Being good in Kali is like trying to walk uphill on ice. The slope is against you on the surface. That can sound a lot like the Zoroastrian story, a good beginning, a worsening middle, a final crisis. Both systems talk about truth and falsehood, order and disorder, a long slide into a dark age, followed by some kind of restoration. But the scaffolding around those stories is very different. Start with scale. Remember that neat Zoroastrian 12,000-year frame? 4 blocks of 3,000 years, one complete drama. In the Yuga system, the numbers explode. A single Mahayuga is traditionally given as 4.32 million years. 1,000 of those make a day of Brahma, the creator god. Then there are nights of Brahma, his years, his full lifespan. You quickly hit numbers so large they're basically there to say, this cycle is unimaginably big. So yes, both traditions love number symbolism. Both carve up time into 4 parts. Both use multiples of 3 or 12 or 4 to give cosmic history a pleasing geometry. But what those numbers are doing is slightly different. In the Zoroastrian scheme, 12,000 years is short enough that you can, in principle, line it up with semi-historical events, the birth of Zarathustra, the rise of certain kings, the anticipated arrival of saviors. It's mythic, but it flirts with history. In the Yuga scheme, the vastness itself is the point. The timescales are so huge that no realistic memory can cross from one full cycle to the next. You're not meant to work out dates. You're meant to feel small in the face of a cosmos that has gone through this pattern countless times before and will again. Then there's structure. The Indo-Iranian peoples, ancestors of both the Vedic Indians and the Iranian Zoroastrians, almost certainly shared older ideas about cosmic order, truth and ritual maintenance of the world. You can hear the family resemblance in the very words Sanskrit Ta and Dharma, Avestan Asha. Concepts of rightness. What fits? What keeps the universe running properly? It's very plausible that somewhere back in that shared heritage were germs of world ages, or at least of time being divided into qualitatively different stretches. But the Yuga system we actually see in the Puranas and later Hindu sources is not a simple fossil of that common past. It's a worked-over, elaborated cosmology, built up over centuries, probably drawing on many streams. Likewise, on the Iranian side, the tight 12,000-year breakdown with 4 3,000-year blocks is not obvious in the very oldest Zoroastrian hymns. It emerges clearly in later Middle Persian texts. So when you compare, you're matching late, developed systems, not raw Indo-Iranian folklore. Could they still have influenced each other, maybe? Iran and northwestern India were not sealed-off worlds. There were Indo-Aryan groups in Iranian territory and Iranian-speaking groups in what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Empires, the Achaemenids, later the Kushans, even the early Islamic caliphates, created corridors where priests, traders and storytellers rubbed shoulders. It's entirely possible that Indian thinkers knew something about Iranian end-time ideas, and vice versa. Some scholars have even suggested that the very feel of counting down in Kali Yuga, expecting a future Vishnu avatar to set things right, may have brushed against Zoroastrian ideas of saviours and a final renovation. But we're in the realm of possibilities, not smoking gun proofs. The similarities are broad. 4 ages, moral decline, final rectification. They're impressive, but they're also the sort of patterns humans tend to invent independently when they watch empires rise and fall and feel like things were better in the old days. Look at the key differences and the picture sharpens. First, recurrence. In classical Hindu cosmology, after Kali Yuga runs its course, there isn't one single once-for-all upgrade of the universe. There's a reset into a new Satya Yuga, the Golden Age returns, and the cycle of 4 yugas starts again. That set of 4 is itself one among many, cycles within cycles. Zoroastrianism, by contrast, is deeply allergic to that kind of endless looping. Once Frashokereti happens, that's it. There's no next Kali sneaking in the back door. Evil is neutralized, not parked until the next round. Second, cosmology. Yuga time is framed inside the lives of deities like Brahma and Vishnu. The universe appears, subsists, and dissolves in rhythms tied to divine breathing, waking and sleeping. Creation and destruction are natural pulsations of the cosmic body. In Zoroastrian thought, creation is a deliberate act by Ahura Mazda to counter and ultimately defeat an invading evil. Time is a tactical arena, not the breath cycle of a god. There's no suggestion that the world will be allowed to fall back into chaos as a matter of routine. Third, saviours. Hindu Yuga doctrine comes with the idea of avatars. Vishnu descends in different forms across the ages to protect Dharma. In the current Kali Yuga, a future avatar, Kalki, is expected to appear, destroy unrighteousness, and restore Satya Yuga conditions. Zoroastrianism also has future saviours, the 3 Saoshyants, culminating in a final figure who leads the last renovation. But they aren't recurring avatars cycling through an eternal pattern. They're climactic agents in a story that only runs once. So yes, you can put the 2 systems side by side and draw some striking parallels. 4 ages, moral slope downward, end-time hero. You can point to shared Indo-Iranian ancestors and long stretches of historical contact where ideas could have travelled. But similarity is not automatic evidence of direct borrowing. Some of it may be common inheritance, some may be mutual influence. Some may just be what happens when different cultures look at the same unsettling data, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the memory of better times, the experience of living in what feels like a degraded age, and try to fold it into a cosmic pattern. Keep that caution in mind as we move on to Mesopotamia, where the pattern of floods, king lists, and resets takes on a very different shape again, and where world ages are measured not in Yugas or 3,000-year blocks, but in dynasties, disasters, and the uneasy feeling that civilization itself is always one bad flood away from being wiped off the map. When you shift from India's enormous Yuga cycles over to Mesopotamia, the mood changes immediately. You're not looking up at an almost abstract cosmic calendar anymore. You're ankle-deep in river mud, staring at levees and storm clouds and wondering whether the gods are about to drown everything you've built. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the big anxiety is not which Yuga are we in. It's how long can we keep this thing going before the next disaster hits? That anxiety shows up everywhere in their stories. Think about the Mesopotamian flood traditions, the Atrahasis epic, the flood episode inside the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Sumerian flood stories behind them. The basic pattern is familiar. The gods create humans. Humans multiply, but instead of humans have become wicked, like later biblical retellings. The Mesopotamian complaint is often more practical, more bureaucratic. Humans are noisy, disruptive, too many. They're bothering the high gods. They're messing with the cosmic workload arrangement. So the gods decide to thin the herd. First with plagues, then with droughts, then finally with a catastrophic flood. A single overwhelming act of destruction that wipes out cities, erases dynasties, and almost ends the human experiment. One man, Atrahasis or Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, is warned. He builds a boat. He rides out the storm with his family and some animals. Afterwards he offers sacrifice. The gods regret going quite that far. They grant the survivor a special status and swear off doing that level of annihilation again, at least in exactly the same way. On one level, these are just flood stories from a floodplain. You live in a river system where water levels can rise suddenly and erase entire settlements. You don't need an advanced theology class to start asking whether the gods are angry. But look at what the stories are doing conceptually. They're not laying out a neat, four-part cosmic plan. They're dramatizing the idea that civilization is fragile, that there is a line which, if crossed, too many people, too much noise, too much hubris, can trigger a reset. Not a moral, eschatological resolution in the Zoroastrian sense, but a catastrophe reset. Clean slate. Start over with one family, one boat, one altar. You see the same nervousness in the Sumerian king list. On the surface, it's just a list of rulers and cities. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, then it was in Bad Tibira, then Shuruppak, and so on. Rulers with impossibly long reigns, then more realistic ones. Dynasties rise and fall. The capital shifts from city to city. Then, right in the middle, the text drops a bomb. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. In one line, everything before is put into a different box. There's before the flood and after the flood, an earlier world and a later world. Same earth, same general culture zone, but separated by a civilizational event that resets the clock. Notice what's missing, though. There's no detailed numbered sequence of world ages with fixed moral profiles. No promise that after X dynasties or Y years evil will be permanently neutralized and creation renovated once and for all. Instead, kingship descends from heaven again. The pattern resumes. We go back to politics, to succession, to conquests. The flood marks a rupture, but not a final one. The game restarts on the same board with slightly different pieces. This is where the comparison with Zoroastrianism gets interesting. Both worlds are thinking about resets. Both imagine that human history is not just a smooth, endless line, but punctuated by episodes where the gods intervene massively. But the mechanisms and the meanings are different. In Mesopotamia, catastrophe is usually about management and containment. The gods are overwhelmed by human noise, or disturbed by human behavior, or divided among themselves. They unleash a flood, or drought, or famine to fix the imbalance. The surviving humans and gods then renegotiate the terms, boundaries, rituals, taboos. Time goes on. There's no sense that each disaster is one tick closer to a guaranteed, once-for-all defeat of evil. The Zoroastrian schema, in contrast, takes that nervous sense of we could be wiped out and welds it into a linear moral arc. Disaster in that world is not just divine irritation. It is part of a war with an enemy principle that will end. The final reset, Frashokereti, is not a flood that wipes cities and then lets the old logic return. It's a renovation that removes the possibility of that kind of collapse ever happening again. Those are very different uses of the same human memory, that things break, that worlds end for somebody. Now could ideas about floods and resets have travelled between Mesopotamia and the Iranian world? Very likely in some form. The ancient Near East was a dense mesh of contact zones. Trade routes ran from the Persian Gulf up into Mesopotamia and out toward Anatolia and Iran. Empires like the Akkadians, Assyrians, and later the Achaemenids and Babylonians ruled territories that spanned these regions. Merchants, soldiers, scribes, and priests moved with them. You don't need a Zoroastrian priest reading the Atrahasis tablet in the original Akkadian for influence to happen. Stories leak through borderlands as motifs, not as verbatim texts. A traveller tells of a time when the gods drowned a whole land, but one wise man built a vessel and survived. A local bard folds that into his own mythic landscape. A priest tasked with explaining why his city lies on ancient flood deposits reaches for similar images: divine judgment, near total destruction, a righteous remnant. Ideas can travel as rumours and shared anxieties. They get re-theologized in each culture's own framework. What doesn't seem to travel, at least not in any straightforward, traceable way, is the very specific Zoroastrian move, compressing the whole story of creation, contamination, struggle, and final purification into a single 12,000-year package with a moral teleology. Mesopotamian texts don't do that. They measure long time in reign lengths, dynasties, temple foundations, since the days of so-and-so king. Their ages are political and environmental, not cosmic blocks laid out in advance. So when modern reset narratives line up the Mesopotamian flood, the Zoroastrian 12,000 years, the Hindu Yugas, and maybe a few geological events, and then say, look, all these cultures are describing the same 12,000-year catastrophe cycle. They're collapsing very different mechanisms and meanings into one flat picture. The Mesopotamian flood stories are about the precariousness of civilization under capricious powers. The Zoroastrian timeline is about a morally charged, dualistic universe grinding toward an irreversible victory. One gives you periodic catastrophe with a restart button. The other gives you a plotted drama with a final curtain. Keeping that distinction clear is crucial if you want to ask the next question honestly. When Greek and later thinkers start talking about world ages and cosmic fires, are they echoing Mesopotamian floods, Iranian eschatology, their own observations, or some mix of all three? By the time we get to the Greek world, that nervous sense of things end hasn't gone away, but it's been reframed. The question is no longer just, will the gods flood us again? It becomes, what kind of age are we living in, and where does it sit in a larger cosmic pattern? You can hear that in one of the most famous Greek schemes of all, the ages of man. In Hesiod's version, you don't have one flood dividing before and after. You have a descending staircase. First, a golden age under Kronos. Humans live like gods without toil, without grief. The earth gives freely. Death is gentle. It's as close as Greek myth gets to a world that doesn't need a reset at all. Then comes the Silver Age. People are still long-lived, but foolish, impious. Zeus wipes them out. Then Bronze. Violent, warlike, obsessed with weapons. They destroy themselves. After that, a kind of side branch. The Age of Heroes. Semi-divine figures, Trojan war types who get sent to a paradise or Isle of the Blessed. And finally the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time. Short lives, hard work, injustice everywhere. He says, flat out, that this is a degraded era and that Zeus will one day destroy even this age too. On the surface, this doesn't look much like a Zoroastrian 12,000-year grid. There's no explicit timetable, no countdown, no detailed end-time scenario. And yet the structure is doing something similar, dividing history into qualitatively different eras, each with its own moral temperature. Golden is closest to what Zoroastrianism would call a creation untouched by the hostile spirit. Iron is closest to the period of maximum mixture, maximum distortion. But here's the key difference. Hesiod's system is mostly pessimistic nostalgia. The good stuff is all in the past. The arc is downward. There's no clear promise of a renovated world in which evil is permanently purged and the righteous live forever in a transformed creation. If there's a reset, it's implied as another destruction, another wipeout, not a guaranteed victory that upgrades the whole cosmos. Greek philosophers push this even further. They start asking whether not just human history, but the entire universe moves in cycles. That's where the great year comes in. You see bits and pieces of it in Plato, in later Platonists, in Stoics and astrologers. The idea, roughly, is that there's an immense cosmic period after which the heavenly bodies return to the exact same configuration. Stars, planets, everything back in alignment. Some writers treat that as a purely astronomical curiosity, a gigantic clock tick after which the sky's pattern repeats. Others load it with meaning. When the heavens reset, history resets with them. Different versions give different lengths. Some say 36,000 years, some tie it to specific planetary conjunctions, some are vague. The numbers are all over the place, but the logic is the same. Beneath the mess of human politics, there is a deep cycle, a cosmic breath in and out. The Stoics radicalize this. In their system, the great year isn't just about stars returning to their starting point. It's about everything returning. At the end of a great year, they say, the universe is consumed in a cosmic fire. Ekpyrosis. This isn't a local wildfire or a volcanic eruption. It is a total conflagration, a burning up of the entire ordered world back into a kind of primordial divine fire, which for them is basically God. And then from that fire, the universe is reborn. Same logos, same rational pattern. In some versions, even the same events, the same people, the same conversations recur. Eternal recurrence, not just of structure, but of content. Burn, reset, replay as a reset image. That starts to sound much closer to eschatology than to everyday weather anxiety. Fire that cleanses the world. A cycle that includes destruction and renewal. A sense that whatever we're experiencing now is one phase in a larger, pre-patterned cosmic story. If you've been listening closely to the Zoroastrian material, your ears probably perk up at this point. Zoroastrian end-time imagery, especially in later texts, loves fire. At the end of the 12,000 years, the molten metal river sweeps across the earth, burning away Drudge, the lie, purging the creation. The righteous experience it as warm milk, the wicked as unbearable torment. The world is melted down and cast again, but in a perfected form. That does sound, at an abstract level, like a fire that resets reality. But the details and the direction are different. For the Stoics, ekpyrosis is cyclical and infinite. Fire ends the world returns, the same rational order plays out again, and there is no final state where evil is abolished for good. There is no last great year after which the cycle stops. The reset button gets hit forever. For Zoroastrianism, the fiery purge is a one-time climactic event at the end of a linear story. After Frashokereti, there is no more need for cycles, because the core problem, cosmic contamination by the hostile spirit, is solved. Time, in a sense, cashes out into a stable, perfected eternity. So you can line up the motifs, fire, purification, renewal, and see family resemblances. But if you zoom in on the logic, they're doing opposite things. One explains why the play keeps looping, the other why the play ends. Did Greeks and Iranians influence each other here? Historically, they had the opportunity. From the late 6th century BCE on, Greek thinkers are living in a world dominated off and on by Persian empires. Ionia is under Achaemenid control during the early phases of Greek philosophy. Later, Alexander's conquest smashes the border and creates a Hellenistic mesh stretching from Greece to Egypt to Iran to Central Asia. In that mesh you have Greek philosophers, Babylonian astronomer priests, Iranian magi, Egyptian temple scholars, all moving through shared cities, Babylon, Seleucia, Alexandria, Antioch. We know that Greeks were fascinated by Chaldean, which often means Mesopotamian star wisdom, and that they lumped various Eastern priestly traditions together under labels like Magoi. We also know that Zoroastrian communities continue to exist under Hellenistic and then Parthian and Sasanian rule, and that some Iranian ideas did seep into Greek and later Roman thought, especially in the religious sphere. But when you try to draw a straight arrow from Zoroastrian fire purification to Stoic ekpyrosis, or from 12,000-year plan to great year, the evidence gets thin fast. You can make plausible stories. A Stoic hears some version of Iranian end-time teaching filtered through Babylonian astrology. He already believes the cosmos is a living fire. He combines the motifs. The world periodically burns up and begins again, and the timing is linked to the grand celestial cycles. Or, on the flip side, later Zoroastrian authors operating in a Hellenized Iranian world become more comfortable describing Frashokereti with language that sounds a bit more like Stoic or Platonic cosmic fire and renewal. Those are not crazy scenarios. Cultural crosstalk in the Hellenistic and late antique periods is real. Manichaeism is the classic example of a religion that openly blends Iranian, Christian, and Greek philosophical material. But influence in these specific cases is hard to prove. The texts don't come with footnotes saying, "We got this from such and such Stoic," or from a magus of X province. Often what we're seeing might not be direct borrowing at all, but parallel responses to shared experiences. Fire as the ultimate purifier, the sky as the ultimate clock, catastrophe as the hinge between ages. What we can say with some confidence is this. By the time you're in late antiquity, the Mediterranean Iranian world is full of layered schemes of time. Greek poets talk about metals and declining ages. Philosophers talk about great years and cosmic fires. Zoroastrian priests hold on to a 12,000-year linear drama with a final renovation. Christian and Jewish thinkers living under Persian and then Hellenistic and Roman empires will start to pick and choose from all of these, and that's where the reset conversation shifts again, from cyclic fire and eternal return into something much closer to the Zoroastrian picture. One end, one judgment, one renovated creation. By the time we get to the biblical and later Abrahamic material, that one end, one judgment, one renovated creation framework is no longer a fringe idea. It's right at the centre. But it doesn't start that way. If you look at the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible, the eschatology is modest. The dead go to Sheol, a kind of shadowy underworld. Not torture, not bliss, more like a divine basement. There isn't a worked-out doctrine of individual resurrection. Justice is mostly this worldly, blessings and curses in history, victory or defeat for the nation, long life or early death. God judges, but the courtroom is history itself. Then something shifts. By the time you're in the late biblical books, Daniel, parts of Isaiah, some of the later Psalms, you start to hear a very different tone. Now the question isn't just, will God rescue Israel from foreign empires? It's, what about all the injustice that never got fixed in this life? What about martyrs? What about the faithful who died crushed? At that point, options narrow. Either the universe is fundamentally unfair, or there is a horizon beyond ordinary history where accounts are settled. Enter resurrection and final judgment. In Daniel 12, written under heavy imperial pressure, probably in the 2nd century BCE, you suddenly get this: many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. That is a radical move. The grave is no longer the end. The body is not a disposable shell. The dead can be summoned back, evaluated, and their fate permanently sorted. From there, Second Temple Jewish literature takes the idea and runs with it. Apocalypses talk about books of deeds, thrones of judgment, cosmic trials. A day of the Lord that doesn't just smash armies, but reorders creation. Christianity inherits that late Second Temple picture and doubles down. Jesus talks about a coming Son of Man, separating sheep from goats, the dead being raised, a renewed heaven and earth. Paul insists that the resurrection is not some vague spiritual survival, it's a transformed, imperishable body. Revelation paints the most famous version: Last Judgment, Lake of Fire, New Jerusalem, death itself destroyed. Islam, emerging in a Near Eastern world already saturated with these ideas, places them front and centre from the start. Qiyamah, the resurrection. Mizan, the scales. Sirat, the bridge over hell. A bodily raising of all humanity. Divine judgment that weighs deeds and intentions. Paradise gardens and a blazing fire, followed by a reordered cosmos in which God's justice is visible and irreversible. So across Judaism, Christianity and Islam, you get a cluster of themes that sound, to Zoroastrian ears, very familiar: a final resurrection of the dead, a last judgment where deeds are weighed, a personal and cosmic adversary, Satan, Iblis, whose rebellion is finally dealt with, and a transformed world in which the faithful live in a renewed creation, not as disembodied spirits, but as embodied beings in a repaired reality. Did those motifs flow out of Persian religion straight into Abrahamic scripture? That's where things get contentious. Historically, the timing lines up suspiciously well. The sharpest turn in Jewish eschatology happens during and after the Persian period. Judah is a tiny province under Achaemenid rule. Judean elites are operating inside an imperial system where Zoroastrian priestly ideas about cosmic dualism, judgment, and world renovation are in the air. Some scholars argue that's not a coincidence. They point out parallels: a final bodily rising, a global judgment, reward and punishment in a renewed world, a cosmic opponent opposed to God's plan, an end to death itself. They note that before the exile, those ideas are weak or absent in Israelite religion, and after the exile they start to crystallize fast. On that reading, Persian imperial rule is a kind of theological catalyst. Judean thinkers encounter Iranian schemes of time and destiny and adapt them into their own monotheistic framework. Later, Christianity and Islam inherit that already Persian-tinted eschatology. Other scholars push back hard. They argue you don't need Iranian influence to explain any of this. Once you have a single just God, and you live through national catastrophe, exile and oppression, the moral math pushes you towards some kind of deferred judgment. Ordinary history obviously isn't fair. Good people suffer. Tyrants die in comfort. A final sorting beyond history is one of the few ways to preserve both divine justice and observable reality. From that angle, resurrection and last judgment are not imported doctrines. They're internal solutions to the problem of evil inside a monotheistic story. There are also technical points. Zoroastrian resurrection happens after the molten metal ordeal, in a fully renovated world where evil has been burned out of the fabric of reality itself. The resurrected live forever in a perfected material creation, and even the damned are ultimately purified. In much Jewish and Christian tradition, by contrast, judgment can result in permanent exclusion, a split between eternal life and some form of ongoing death or destruction. Islamic theology debates whether hell is eternal or ultimately finite, but the basic structure, resurrection, weighing of deeds, heaven and hell, is framed differently than the Zoroastrian universal purification through fire. Similarly, the Zoroastrian cosmic adversary, Angra Mainyu, is a primordial anti-creative spirit locked in a time-bounded conflict. The Abrahamic Satan starts more as an accuser or tester in the divine council, only later evolving in some strands of thought into a near-cosmic opponent. The genealogies look parallel, but not identical. So what are we looking at? Probably not a simple pipeline where priests in Persepolis hand over a script and Jewish prophets just translate it. More likely a messier picture. Shared imperial spaces where Judeans, Iranians, Babylonians and others all live under the same kings, worry about the same conquests, see the same injustices, and ask the same burning question: if God or the gods are just, when does that justice actually show up? Under that pressure, certain answers almost advertise themselves. There will be a last act. The dead will not stay dead. What you do now will be revealed and judged later. The world you see is not the final version. Whether those answers owe their specific phrasing to Persian theology, or arise independently in multiple traditions facing similar moral and political crises, the result is the same: a powerful linear story in which history moves toward a definitive end of the age. Which brings us back to the 12,000-year plan. Because once you have that kind of ending, another question appears. Why this long? Why this structure? Why these numbers? And that's where we need to look at the math of sacred time itself. So why 12,000? Why not 9,000? Or 60 million, or however long it takes? Why does this very specific, very round-sounding number keep showing up in Zoroastrian texts, and in modern reset discourse that riffs on them? To get at that, we have to zoom out from Persia for a second and look at how human beings in general use numbers when they talk about time. When you and I count, we usually pretend numbers are neutral. 7 is just 7, 12 is just 12. But in most traditional cultures, numbers are not neutral. They're loaded. They carry flavors, associations, symbolic jobs. And the bigger and rounder the number, the more likely it is to stop being a measurement and start being a statement. Think about how we talk today. We say 1,000 times, 1,000,000 years, for ages, and we don't mean we pulled out a calculator. We mean a lot, long enough to matter, cosmically big. Ancient writers did that too, but with their own favourite building blocks. Zoroastrian tradition seems to do something like that with 12,000. On one level, you can see it as cosmic bookkeeping. 12,000 years divided into 4 neat chunks of 3,000 each. Creation in blueprint, creation in mixture, turning of the tide, final renovation. It's not just a number, it's a syllabus, a way to teach the entire story of the universe in 4 acts with a simple ratio. That has advantages. It's easy to remember. It gives every phase a clear function. It lets priests and storytellers map everything, prophets, saviors, dynasties, disasters, into a pre-labelled grid. You're never just in history. You're in year X of scheme Y, somewhere in Act 3 out of 4. Humans love that kind of structure. We like beginnings, middles, and ends. We get confused by endless drift. 12,000 in that sense is a gigantic narrative bracket, big enough to feel cosmic, finite enough to feel graspable. You can imagine it. You can talk about the first 3,000 and the last 3,000 and feel like you're holding all of creation between your mental fingers. But there's a second layer here. Why 12 specifically? 12 is one of those numbers that pops up all over the ancient world. 12 months in a year, 12 signs in the zodiac. In many cultures, 12 major gods, 12 tribes, 12 gates, 12 stages. There's a practical reason for some of that. If you're watching the sky and tracking the seasons, the sun appears to move through roughly 12 distinct star backdrops over the course of a year. The moon cycles about 12 times from new to full and back, while the Earth does one trip around the sun. 12 is just baked into the way the heavens look to the naked eye. Once that happens, 12 stops being just another number and starts becoming an organizing principle. You can divide it neatly by 2, 3, 4, and 6. That makes it a dream for calendar makers, astrologers, temple architects, anyone trying to carve continuous flow into meaningful chunks. If the sky itself seems to endorse 12 as a basic unit, then using multiples of 12 for cosmic time feels appropriate. So when a Zoroastrian priest says the world has a 12,000-year story, you can almost hear the subtext, a full cycle of heaven's order, scaled up into history. The same logic that makes 12 constellations outline the year now makes 12,000 years outline the age of mixture and redemption. And then you get 3,000-year phases sitting inside that 12,000. 3 is another heavy hitter. Past, present, future, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, threefold fire, threefold world. You get a nested structure. Little sacred number inside big sacred number, working like gears in a clock. Whether anyone in late Achaemenid Iran sat down and said, "We will now consciously express an astronomical numerological metaphysics in our chronology that we don't know." But the fit is hard to miss. This is where the psychology kicks in. Schematized time doesn't just make priests happy. It makes people feel oriented. If the universe is chaotic, if empires are rising and collapsing around you, if plagues and famines show up with no warning, you want more than stuff happens. A numbered plan offers something else, a sense that even the horrors are in a chapter, and chapters end. When you say we are in the last 3,000-year period, you're not just placing yourself on a chart. You're making a mood statement. You're saying, this is the decisive era. The pressure we feel is meaningful. The corruption we see is a symptom of the ending of an age, not proof that the whole story is pointless, that has teeth in times of crisis. Think about how people today latch on to every 1,200 years there's a catastrophe, or every 12,000 years the Earth resets, even when the science is, at best, murky. It's emotionally easier to believe that cataclysms follow a pattern than to accept that they're random. If there's a rhythm, you can brace for the beat. You can imagine yourself as a character who just happens to live near a crucial turn of the wheel. Ancient adherents weren't any less intelligent than we are. They lived through war, plague, political humiliation. A 12,000-year plan, with its careful phases and promised renovation, gave them a way to say, this is not the whole story. We are somewhere in the middle of a measured arc. Notice, though, what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that, because 12 is important, and 12,000 is tidy, there must literally be a hidden planetary disaster switch that flips on a fixed 12 millennia timer. That's the leap modern reset narratives often make, from symbolic structure to physical schedule. In religious context, sacred numbers are allowed to be more fluid than that. They can be pedagogical, they can be liturgical, they can be mnemonic devices for complex theologies. They can gesture at perceived harmonies between heaven and earth, the way calendars, rituals, and moral histories all seem to echo each other, and they can still, in certain cases, line up with real natural cycles, climate rhythms, orbital patterns, without being designed as precision forecasts in the way we mean forecast today. Before we go deeper into those modern reset claims, quick note, if you're into this whole business of 12 showing up in weird places, we actually put together a short book on 12 unexplained historical mysteries that keep coming up in our research. You can grab it on the channel's website. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to dig into those on your own time. Back to the 12,000-year clock. The safest way to read it is as a map of meaning, not a NASA mission timetable. It tells you that the story has a beginning, a structured middle with rising conflict, and an end where justice and order are restored. It uses a number, 12, that already feels cosmically right to people living under the stars, exactly because their calendars and constellations are already counted that way. So when we see that same number echo in India's Yugas, in Greek ideas of great cycles, or in modern internet theories about periodic cataclysms, we shouldn't immediately jump to secret cross-cultural engineering project or lost global civilization that knew the real 12,000-year danger. We should first ask a quieter question. What does this number do inside the story? Who needs it and why? Because once you understand that, you're in a much better position to sort out where sacred math ends and where actual geology, astronomy, and history begin. So let's talk about that jump. Because right now, online, you can find people taking Zoroastrian timelines, Hindu Yugas, Mayan calendars, Plato's Atlantis, half-remembered Ice Age events, and a couple of geology papers and mashing them all together into one giant, every X thousand years the world hard resets narrative. Sometimes it's a comet, sometimes it's a pole shift, a micronova, a lost advanced civilization, getting wiped out over and over. The details change, the structure doesn't. Ancients warned us. Moderns ignored them. The reset is overdue. Wake up. Some of that comes from genuine curiosity. People notice that many cultures have talk about ages and endings and floods. They see numbers like 12, 1,200, 12,000 pop up in different traditions. It feels like a code, a pattern begging to be cracked. That instinct to compare, to connect, is not wrong. It's the basis of comparative mythology. But there's a huge difference between responsible comparison and pattern hunting on turbo mode. Responsible comparative work asks boring questions first. What texts are we actually dealing with? How old are they? In what language? Who copied them? Who translated them? What was going on politically and religiously when these ideas were written down? Conspiracy-style reset narratives skip most of that. They zoom straight to the punchline. Look, both these numbers have a 12 in them, therefore global cataclysm cycle. So how do you, watching this, tell the difference? One tool is what you could call a source hierarchy. At the top, you've got primary texts and artifacts, the Avesta, Pahlavi books, inscriptions, actual temples, coins, calendars. Next, you've got serious scholarly work that tries to date and interpret those things, and that explains where the gaps and disagreements are. Down the ladder, you get popular books and documentaries. At the very bottom, you've got memes, TikToks, and image macros with dramatic music. If someone's reset theory lives entirely at the bottom, no citations, no dates, no sense of which text came first, they're not doing comparative mythology. They're remixing vibes. Second tool, dating. Zoroastrian 12,000-year schemes in the form we know them are late, Sasanian era and after, already filtering centuries of development and probably some back projection of historical events into cosmic time. Indian Yuga systems also evolve. The neat, hyper-long 4-age cycle is not just stamped on a single Bronze Age tablet. Plato's floods and cataclysms are 4th century BCE Greek philosophy, not eyewitness accounts from 10,000 BCE engineers. When somebody lines up all those timelines and treats them as independent ancient witnesses to the exact same disaster schedule, they're ignoring the fact that most of these texts are relatively late in conversation with each other's worlds and already doing theology and politics, not geology. Third tool, transmission paths. Ideas travel. Persian imperial rule touches the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek and Jewish writers pick up Near Eastern motifs. Later, Islamic thinkers inherit and rework Zoroastrian and Greek materials. Medieval and early modern Europeans read all of that through their own lenses. So if we find, say, a 6,000 or 12,000 year scheme in a late antique Christian text, that doesn't prove an independent second witness to a hidden cataclysm timer. It might just mean someone in late antique Syria heard about Persian world ages, liked the symmetry and adapted the structure to their own theology. Ignoring transmission paths is like seeing 5 people in a room tell the same joke and deciding there must be telepathy, instead of noticing that one guy told it first, and the rest copied it. Fourth tool, falsifiability. Physical reset claims. Every 12,000 years there's a global civilization wipeout, our scientific claims. That means we can look for evidence. Craters, global burn layers, synchronized extinction events, clear signals in ice cores and sediments. So far, we see lots of local and regional disasters, some very real climate swings, and a few absolute monsters like the end of the Ice Age, but nothing that lines up as a clean, ticking, 12 millennia kill switch. When a theory keeps shifting the goalposts, well, it's not exactly 12,000. Well, maybe it's energetic, not physical. Well, maybe the evidence was hidden. That's a sign you've left the realm of testable hypothesis and drifted into storytelling. And that brings us back to Zoroastrianism. On the internet, you'll see the 12,000-year plan stripped of almost everything that makes it Zoroastrian. The cosmic battle of truth and lie becomes light beings versus archons. Frashokereti becomes planetary reset. Saoshyants become ascended masters or star children. The timeline is lifted out, shaved down and plugged into a narrative that's mostly about impending physical catastrophe and elite cover-ups. What gets lost in that translation? Ethics, for one. In the original frame, the point of knowing you're in a particular age isn't to prep your bunker. It's to choose truth over the lie, to live good thoughts, good words, good deeds, because history is morally charged and your actions genuinely help tip the balance toward renovation. Also lost, humility about knowledge. Traditional Zoroastrian texts don't pretend humans can compute the end date from first principles. They receive it as revelation, hold it liturgically, and leave a lot of the mechanics to God. The online versions often flip that. We have cracked the code. They are hiding it, and if you watch 3 more videos, you'll be part of the initiated few. None of this means we should sneer at people who are drawn to reset stories. The pull is real. In a world that feels chaotic, climate anxiety, political turmoil, tech upheaval, The idea that there's a big cycle, a pattern, a known storm that comes around on schedule can feel more comforting than things break for complicated, partly random reasons. And there is something undeniably human about imagining yourself at the hinge of an age. Whether you're a Sasanian Zoroastrian hearing that you live in the last 3,000-year period, or a 21st century YouTube viewer convinced the 12,000-year reset is imminent, the emotional logic is similar. My time matters. These pressures mean something. So maybe the better question isn't, are all these reset stories literally true? That one we can chip away at with geology, astronomy, and textual criticism. The deeper question is, what does it say about us that across millennia, across religions, and now across algorithms, we keep reaching for narratives in which the world runs on a giant clock, periodically shakes the etch-a-sketch, and invites a handful of survivors to start again? We'll end by turning that question on the Zoroastrian timeline itself. If we strip away the YouTube overlays and the doomscroll cataclysms, what does a 12,000-year plan really suggest about how those ancient thinkers saw the universe? And what, very specifically, it does not claim about literal planetary resets? So first, let's answer that question straight. What does the Zoroastrian 12,000-year plan actually say? If you zoom out and trace the arc, it's brutally simple. In the beginning, there is a perfect, timeless creation. No death, no decay, no mixture. That's the first 3,000 years, the blueprint phase. Reality as Ahura Mazda intends it, but held in a kind of suspended animation. Then the adversary strikes, Angra Mainyu crashes into that timeless order, and time in a deep sense starts. The next 3,000 years are the invasion and entanglement of good and evil, spirit and matter. Creation becomes vulnerable. The world we inhabit is not a neutral stage. It's a battlefield where every thought, word and deed takes a side. The third block of 3,000 years is where the moral experiment becomes personal. Humans arrive. Zarathustra appears. Revelation is given. People are told explicitly, here's the map, here's the enemy, here's your role. The cosmic drama isn't just gods and demons anymore, it runs through human choices. The final 3,000 years are the age of pressure and decision. Evil seems stronger, things decay, social order frays. But that visible decline is not the end of the story. It's the prelude to Frashokereti, the Renovation, a definitive endpoint where the mixture of good and evil is finally sorted out. The universe is purified, and time as we know it, time as conflict, stops. That's not a loop. It's not a wheel that rolls back to the start and does it all again. It's a line with a beginning, middle, and end. Now, when we compare that to other traditions, there are real overlaps. India's Yugas, Greek ages of man, Mayan Bactrans, late antique, great year speculation, even modern secular talk about ages of history. They all slice time into chunks, often with a golden beginning, a messy middle, and a crisis-heavy end. They often imagine decline, from purity to mixture, from order to chaos. They often imagine a threshold, a flood, a fire, a judgment, a cleansing that resets or renovates the situation. Those parallels are interesting, they're not nothing. They tell us that across cultures people like to think in eras, in morally charged phases, in stories where the present is a hinge between what was and what will be. They show how tempting it is to line up numbers, 4 ages, 7 stages, 12,000 years, and feel like you're glimpsing the gears of some cosmic clock. But the mechanisms and meanings are not all the same. Indian Yugas, in their classic form, are explicitly cyclical. Golden Age, decline, collapse, then a new Golden Age, rinse and repeat. Greek Great Year ideas often tie to astronomy, long cycles of the stars that bring back similar configurations. Some Mesopotamian traditions treat floods and king lists as ways to mark off past disruptions, not coded promises of future timers. Zoroastrianism, especially in its later, more systematic form, lands on something else, a one-shot story. One creation, one contamination, one renovation. No endless loop of suffering. No eternal turning of the wheel. The 12,000-year framework is not a kill switch that flips every time the calendar wraps around. It's the total span of the drama, so we need a bit of epistemic humility here. Where is the evidence strong? When we say Zoroastrian texts talk about 12,000 years divided into 4 3,000-year periods, ending in Frashokereti, that's grounded in actual Pahlavi sources, in manuscripts we can date, in traditions living communities still remember. When we say late antique Christians, Jews and Muslims picked up Persian and other Near Eastern motifs, that's supported by textual parallels, historical contact, and explicit citations. When we start claiming all of these are independent witnesses to a precise 12,000-year physical cataclysm cycle that runs like clockwork, the ground gets much thinner. We don't have an ancient global spreadsheet where Zoroastrian priests, Vedic seers, Maya astronomers and Greek philosophers compared notes and agreed on a geological timer. We have scattered texts written in different languages at different times for different theological and political reasons. We have plausible transmission paths, we have big interpretive gaps. It's fine to explore those gaps with imagination. It's not fine to pretend speculation is data. And yet, even when we strip away the modern reset hype, one puzzle remains. Why do humans keep doing this? Why do we carve time into errors, front-load the past with purity, weight the present with anxiety, and load the future with either catastrophe or cleansing? Part of it is pattern recognition turned inward. We see days, seasons, lifetimes, dawn, noon, dusk, spring, summer, winter, birth, maturity, decay. It's almost inevitable to scale that up to history itself. If you grew up watching the sun rise and set, crops grow and fail, empires rise and fall, why wouldn't you think the universe does something similar? Part of it is moral. A flat, endless timeline is hard to care about. A story with an arc, a beginning, a crisis, a final reckoning, makes your choices feel like they matter. Zoroastrianism leans into that hard, you were born in a specific phase of a finite struggle. What you do helps determine how the story ends. And part of it is psychological comfort. In chaos, a cycle is at least a pattern. A planned end is at least an end. The universe might be harsh, but it isn't random. Someone somewhere knows the schedule. So where does that leave us with the 12,000-year plan? As a window into how one ancient tradition thought about meaning, morality, and destiny. It's incredibly rich. As a literal, verified, multi-civilizational countdown to planetary annihilation every 12,000 years, the evidence just isn't there. That doesn't make the question useless. It just shifts the focus. Instead of asking, when is the next reset? We can ask, what story am I living inside? Who told it to me? What does it say about what I'm supposed to do right now? If you've stayed with this all the way through, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Are you on a late night deep dive, a morning commute, a 3 a.m.? The world is ending YouTube spiral. If you found this useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's into timelines and end times, but maybe hasn't seen this side of the story. And if you want to support the channel in the best way possible, check out the Spotify link in the description and listen there. Every play helps us keep making long-form, evidence-based dives into the myths and timelines that shape how we see our own moment in history.